right. Welcome, everybody, to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny Budinsky, and I am thrilled to be here with three brothers in the Lord to critique another critic of young Earth creation. At this point, I think we've countered and responded to just about every critic out there. And so that's why I think it is going to be a lot of fun to now respond to many of these points put out by Theistic Evolutionist, Redeemed Zoomer, as this is our first response video to him specifically. And so, gentlemen, it's great to have you all here. Sam, my award-winning co-host, many call you the Atheist Slayer. So what's going on, brother? It's great to have you here. You've been here many, many times acting as co-host and debater. But it has been a few weeks, I think, since you've been here. So, Sam, how have you been?
I've been great. You know, summertime's been really busy, got a lot going on, but it's always a joy and a pleasure to be here back with you gentlemen. Hope you guys are all well. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I know you've got some good stuff for us here tonight, some good notes and responses to theistic evolution. Certainly not our first rodeo debunking theistic evolutionism. Ben Kissling, you have been here 3 times in total, so it's not your first time here on Standing for Truth. Last time you were here was for a debate on young Earth creation. Excellent debate. That was with Adam Terry. And before that debate, you were here for a comprehensive examination of theistic evolutionism, specifically from William Lane Craig, and also inspiring philosophy. And those videos still go unchallenged, which means you gave some good responses. Those, one might say they're irrefutable. So, Ben, how have you been since the last time you were here, brother?
I have been sick the last month or so, which is why we canceled the first time. So sorry about that.
No worries.
And also I have since graduated from Biola University with the Master of Arts in Science and Religion. So yay. It was really fun, a really great program. They're an intelligent design based program over there, mostly old Earth, which I knew going in. And so, you know, I try to mix it up a little bit on the class discussion boards every now and then, which is fun. But, you know, you try to keep it on the little bit lower level than social media, hopefully, which I'm used to. But it was fun.
Those debates can get pretty heated, eh?
Yeah, I get blocked a lot when I'm too right to be refuted. So that happens a lot. It happened.
Silence the opposition when you can't refute them.
It happened last week from a physicist I would like to give special notice to for blocking me for being right, named Sarah Sylviander. So yay, Sarah. Guaranteed what happened is some of her followers private messaged her and told her the reason he's making this point, which was about relativity, the points that Jason Lyle makes about the relativity of simultaneity. Guaranteed some of her followers messaged her and said, this guy's a young Earth creationist, and that's why he's saying this. And so she blocked me for posturing. I didn't even use any nasty language or anything, which is usually what happens. But
speaking the truth and refuting their so-called science is nasty language to them.
Yeah. If you attack someone's worldview and you're competent and you're correct, it feels worse than if you're wrong, because if you're wrong, they feel comfortable and respond, right? But if you're right, now they feel attacked, and then they often interpret that as you being mean, right? But that's not what it is.
Right. And all you're doing is countering arguments, giving some worthwhile criticisms and challenges. And we definitely don't shy away from those here, which is why we host a lot of debates. We believe in getting out of our theological and scientific echo chambers for healthy discussion. And Ben, I've got many of your links here where people can see more from you. So there's your X account. We've got your review of William Lane Craig, also your bio. People can find those also in the description box of this video. And so, okay, very good, Ben. We've also got Praise I Am, certainly no stranger to this channel, nor are you a stranger to debates, Praise. So you're one of the debaters in the community. You're kind of a vet. And so it's great to have you as well to respond to many arguments that I think you are going to be very familiar with. As Praise, you have not always been a young earth creationist. So you've seen the other side of this debate. You saw the light. And well, and that's what I was going to say to Ben. If there's a lot of old earth creation at the school you were going to, then you were a light among all of those errors. So that's good. You know, hopefully they got to hear some good challenges. And Praise, you were once on that side in a way, you know. So it's great to have you, Praise. How are you doing, brother?
Oh, man, it's a pleasure to be here with these evolutionist demolishers, Sam, Ben, Donny, bar none the best on the internet, I think, with creation and destroying evolution. So I can't wait to get into it. I can't wait to be the start and stop guy on the YouTube link. So looking forward to that. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. And when you hear something that you want to demolish, Praise, feel free to do so. And we're a debate channel too. So at the end of the day, we don't mind engaging in either informal or formal debates with those that we criticize or challenge as in their arguments. We're not attacking persons, we're attacking arguments. And Matt and I just engaged in a 4.5-hour debate seminar with a prominent evolutionists on YouTube, Culture Cats, formerly known as Conspiracy Cats. And so credit where credit is due. We appreciate when popular YouTubers are willing to enter the debate coliseum and engage these issues. And unfortunately, there's really only a few that are willing. Other Conspiracy Cats, Gutsy Gibbons, another one. And so we wouldn't mind engaging in more debates with prominent evolutionists on the science of Adam and Eve, the science of evolution, because, gentlemen, I'm curious as to your thoughts. Oftentimes you'll see, and Ben, maybe we'll get your thoughts on this. I'll see a lot of debates titled, and you see this with people like Inspiring Philosophy. I think I've seen Redeem Zoomer engage in the debate resolution. Is evolution compatible with the Bible? I want to debate, is evolution compatible with science? Because as people are going to see and have seen, it's not compatible with science. So why would we take a falsified theory, a really bad idea like evolution, which teaches you're related to banana plants and whales, and why would we ruin a perfectly good book, the Bible, God's word, with a theory that's not compatible with science? So that's what we want to engage in debate here. But Ben, I'm curious as to your thoughts, brother.
I mean, if you want a real answer, because for a long time in our culture, it was difficult scientifically to argue against evolution, not only because we don't know the things that we know now. There have always been good arguments against it, for sure, but not as good as there are now. But also because evolutionists pretty much dominated the scholarly class. And so there's sort of a dual thing, right, where Christians want to get back into the academic world and be respected, and they find out very quickly that if you oppose evolution, you are automatically ruled out from getting that respect. And so they knuckle under and try to figure out, okay, how can I, because most of them don't care about evolution, right? They want to be a scientist or some other kind of scholar. And so they try to figure out a way, how can we reconcile theistic evolution with Christianity, with the Bible, and with all these other things, not because they are looking at the arguments and evidence, but because they're affected by peer pressure and the respect that they want to gain for their own career and for Christianity in general in academia, which is not a bad thing. I think Redeem Zoomer is motivated by that. I think clearly. One of the videos of his I watched was there were some things that I agree with him on that, on where he argues that, evangelicals kind of abandoned academia a little bit. And I would impress upon him, yes, there's probably some of that, but there's also discrimination that you face, that he kind of ignores too. But his goal is to make Christianity more acceptable in the wider culture, and that's a good goal. But you can't sacrifice the truth for that.
Right.
You
can't compromise for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've noticed too that some in the theistic evolution world, rather than, because it does take a lot of study to be a young earth creationist, you have to in many ways be very well-rounded. You got to be a jack of all trades, because objections and challenges come in from all fields: geology, astronomy, genetics, biology, you name it. And so being a young earth creationist, especially an apologist, does require a lot of study. And so I've seen a lot of theistic evolutionists, when they're engaging atheists, Sam, I wonder if you've noticed this too, they'll just give them evolution. They'll say, well, let me give you evidence for God. And we don't need to worry about evolution. Sure, the science is there. Common descent is true. Let's go with God. But then problems arise. Well, which God? Because now and a lot of the more popular evolutionists, they like that. Okay, because the evolutionists will give the theistic evolution, the evolutionists will give the theistic evolutionists abiogenesis, right? Sure, I don't know. We don't really have an answer yet. But once they concede common descent, the theistic evolutionist in many ways has given the atheists exactly what they want. Because if all life is related through common ancestry right back to a single celled like ancestor, well, suddenly abiogenesis isn't sounding as far-fetched or extreme. Sam, have you noticed any of those similarities, and what are your thoughts, brother?
Yeah, absolutely. Most atheists, their position is that if they can explain reality without God, then God being a necessary being isn't necessary at all. And that doesn't mean that we should argue with them based on that. I like to argue that we know that God exists because the Bible is true. And there are certain things about this external world, this thing that we call reality, the human experience, that can only make sense because Christianity is true. And it would be like a transcendental type of argument. And along with that, I believe that the argument for biblical creation based on science is also another one of those arguments where, because it's true, they are cornered. They have nowhere to go. And so, of course, the goal is that they be repented and be reconciled with the God that they're running from. But, I was kind of late to find TikTok, but I did.
You've been killing it on there.
Experience as you, Ben, when I go on there and I bring a little bit more of a sophisticated challenge to these critics, I get muted and booted really quick, but that's okay.
All right, well, gentlemen, I think we could go on with these introductions for forever. And so let's kind of jump right into our main topic, a critique of Redeemed Zoomer in theistic evolution. Like Ben said, there are things that I've seen from Redeemed Zoomer that I agree with. I think he says a lot of things that are right. He's definitely within orthodoxy on many of the essentials. But what we're focusing on tonight are things that we disagree with him on, which is the topic of origins and specifically theistic evolution. And so, gentlemen, let's get right into it and set the foundation a little bit by asking you, Ben, a specific question on, especially if somebody's new to the faith, or maybe they're new to the channel and the ongoing origins debate, they might be wondering, what is theistic evolution? What is meant by theistic evolution? And I know that you recently published a paper in the Journal of Creation on theistic evolution and topics related to it. And so could you help us understand what exactly is that position? Why is it important that we're debunking it? And can you tell us a little bit about your new paper?
Yeah, okay. My paper is called Mere Theistic Evolution Fails to Reconcile Evolution and Creation. I'm critiquing a paper called Mere Theistic Evolution, kind of playing off C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. And in that paper, they give a very straightforward, simple, and I think correct definition of theistic evolution. And it is 3 points. The first point is they believe in the God of Christian theism, and they explicitly mention the God who is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, so the 3 omnis. And point number 2 is the old earth. So they mention that in the definition, that and they mention the universe is around 14 billion years old, and the earth is around 4 billion years old. That's their number that they used. So, and the third point is they think that Darwinian evolution, the mechanism of selection acting on random mutation, is the best explanation of biological diversity on Earth that we see today, that we see on Earth today. So they say it's a very good scientific theory and the best explanation that we have going right now. So theistic evolution is very tied up in affirming the Darwinian theory of evolution. Unlike other people that we disagree with, also like Reasons to Believe or Old Earth creationists, most of them disagree with Darwinian evolution. So they would accept the first 2 points that I mentioned in the definition of theistic evolution, God and the old earth, but they would disagree with the third point. So theistic evolutionists are set apart from old earth creationists because they accept Darwinian evolution.
Very good. And can you briefly go into aspects of your new paper here? I do have it pulled up on the Journal of Creation, but it is something you'd have to sign up for, but it is very much related to what we're discussing here tonight. And correct me if I'm wrong, it is the Mere Theistic Evolution Fails to Reconcile Evolution and Creation.
Yeah, so I'm making what I can sort of distill down to a very simple argument. And in fact, in this video we're going to watch, Redeemed Zoomer almost makes the argument for me. He says something to the effect of mutations are not really random. And that's literally all that I am saying, right? But the implications of that are that if you take points 1 of mere theistic evolution, that you believe that God is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, particularly the omnipotent part, and then you add to it the doctrine of creation, which is an essential doctrine of Christianity, that makes point number 1, believing in this God who created everything, incompatible with point number 3, that Darwinian evolution is the true account of biological diversity in the history of life on Earth. Why? Redeemed Zoomer made the point for me, because he is a Calvinist, and I would say he's like a divine determinist. He thinks God, I think the word he used was controls everything. Because of this, he cannot believe that the mutations are really random.
That's right.
Okay. Now, I don't go as far as he does in terms of God's providential control, but it is, even for my position on God's sovereignty, it is still the case that in order for God to be the creator, he must actually create himself. He cannot roll the dice and hope that the right number comes up, right? He can't depend on random mutations to give the result that he wants. He has to do it affirmatively and make sure that it happens, okay? So even on a view like mine, you cannot accept random mutations or the determining factor in any account of creation at all. Okay, so my argument is very simply that you have to accept either one or the other. You can't accept both. You have to say that either God is the creator and evolutionary theory is not true in the correspondence sense of truth, which by that I mean it's the typical definition of truth that apologists and philosophers use, is that truth is what corresponds to reality. Okay, so it cannot be true in that sense that both God is the creator in the traditional Christian sense and that evolutionary theory is also true. And as I said, Redeemed Zoomer almost basically admits this when he says that mutations aren't really random. Well, doesn't that mean that a theory that depends on random mutations must be false?
Yeah.
Yeah, and we debate PhDs in the field of evolutionary theory, and they're militantly against the idea that the majority of mutations are non-random. Now, they will admit that mutations are probabilistic, definitely not deterministic, and most of them being random, creating the necessary variation for selection to act upon. But yeah, I mean, if you're a theistic evolutionist too, and maybe I'm misunderstanding what Redeemed Zoomer means by this, so we'll see in his video, but a lot of the so-called best evidence for common descent relies on arguments such as pseudogenes and the nested hierarchical distribution of a lot of these so-called genetic mistakes shared in the biological world. But if mutations are non-random, well, there goes that argument. And, I could point to several others. So if he's going to argue for the science of evolution, but then also argue that mutations are non-random, he really loses out on the majority of his best arguments.
It's funny you mentioned that. I actually used that in my argument in my paper, that evolutionists require the assumption that mutations are random. Right. When they make these arguments for selection and mutation being the explanation of common descent, they use it explicitly. Okay, and I double checked this with people that I know on Joshua Swaminas's forum who are professional PhD biologists. I gave them I literally posted an early version of this paper on their forum and asked them specifically to critique this part of the paper, to tell me if I was wrong about their view. Nobody in that thread lasted about 50 comments. Not a single one argued with how I presented evolutionary theory in that section of the paper. Wow. And furthermore, I've talked to one of the guys on that forum, hooked me up with his son, who's a postdoctoral researcher, an expert on mutations. And I had an email conversation with him about this as well. Again, confirming my understanding of this. They model mutations as random, and random with respect to their type and position in a DNA sequence. And that precludes God from specifying mutations, even in some kind of directed or guided evolutionary scenario. If God is specifying mutations to occur at a specific place in the DNA sequence or to be a specific type, that violates evolutionary assumptions very obviously.
So if I were to summarize your argument would be that because God knows everything and he's all powerful and God's plan would include mankind, plants and animals, that fundamentally when the theist invokes an evolutionary process, it's never random, it's always guided. So they never are going to be the same thing as, we'll say, like the naturalist.
Oh, wow. Well, that's going to depend on which one you talk to, right? There are theistic evolutionists that will affirm the randomness of mutations.
Okay. Like many at BioLogos.
Yeah, they are definitely on the more liberal side of but they would have views of God's sovereignty that are probably far afield from where Redeemed Zoomer is, or even where I am. In fact, there are theistic evolutionists who've left Christianity entirely because of this. I think that's why Carl Giberson left. I don't think he's a Christian anymore. He was a famous theistic evolutionist for a while.
Do you mean that God would be continually learning things? Like he wouldn't have a plan? I'm just trying to understand how this predicament would be escaped, where you can't have truly random mutations on one hand if God has a plan that would include mankind before creation.
Well, that's kind of, I'm kind of agreeing with you in the paper, and the way I say it is that it is in terms of probabilities. So the paper I'm critiquing talks about probabilities a lot, and they say probabilities aren't absolute truths, they're relative truths. And the implication is that it doesn't matter that evolutionary theory uses probabilities because it's just relative truth, man. You know, I mean, and they say it's relative to background knowledge. And then they admit that according to God's maximal background knowledge, all probabilities would be 1. And then they say, well, according to evolutionary theory, the probabilities would be less than 1. But it doesn't matter because probabilities are relative truths or something. And I'm just trying to guide people back to, look, we need to understand there is one truth, okay? And if God knows what the outcome of his creative action is going to be, whatever his intent is, the probability of him accomplishing his intended purpose is 1. And it can't be less than 1, or you're denying God's sovereignty in a way that I don't think any Christian can accept, regardless of your view on God's sovereignty. Okay, God cannot fail to accomplish his intended result, or he's not really God, right?
Yeah, there's a problem.
Yeah.
Okay, gentlemen, let me jump in here, because these are a lot of good points that I feel like we could expand and expound on during the video itself, as I know he's going to touch on this. And so, okay, I think we've set the foundation. Anybody joining us, anybody who's new to this ongoing origins debate between young earth creationists, old earth creationists, theistic evolutionists, and so on, then I think they've got a good understanding where we're all on the same page here as we now begin to address this video titled Evolution Does Not Contradict the Bible. We will show here by the end of it that evolution, that type of evolution. See, we are also familiar with evolutionists saying what, especially out in public, in my personal life, people that aren't as up to date on this debate as we might be, or those online. If by evolution you mean change over time, then we like to point out as creationists, then we're not going to have much to disagree on. Changes in allele frequencies, changes over time, things change over time, right? Our cell phones, our thinking, so on and so forth. But what Redeem Zoomer means by evolution here is the theory of common descent, large-scale evolution, that all life, including plants and animals, therefore man, chimpanzees, and strawberries, are related through common ancestry. So we're going to show that does contradict the Bible. It also contradicts science. So praise, my good man. Let's get this started.
Fundamentalists and atheists don't like each other very much, but one thing they agree on is that evolution contradicts the Bible. But they're both wrong. People think this because the Bible says God made everything, and they assume that if life developed by the natural process of evolution, it means God didn't make it. But they would say God made them, even though they developed by a natural process. God didn't just snap his fingers and make them fully formed. They developed over time. But God was still in charge of the whole process, because God made space and time. So God made things evolve exactly as he wanted them to. Yes, evolution depends on random mutations, but nothing is truly random since God controls everything. Proverbs 16:33 says that even when humans make a supposedly random decision, like rolling dice, God still determines the outcome. In the Bible, there are 2 ways that God does things. The first is supernaturally, like the parting of the Red Sea, where God actually suspends the laws of nature to directly use his miraculous power. But God also does things providentially, like in the stories of Esther and Joseph, where God arranges all events in history to accomplish his purpose. That's why Genesis 50:20 says, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." Who caused Joseph to be sold into slavery? Was it his brothers or God? The answer is both. His brothers meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. God is like the author, and our universe is like a story that the author is writing. Just because things cause other things in stories doesn't mean the author didn't cause all of it. So creationists would say that the creation of all life in the world was supernatural, but we would say that the creation of the world was providential, and the evolution of all life is something that God wrote into the story of our world. But even if evolution is
Okay, stop
theoretically
it there,
compatible
Praise.
with creation, people...
I'll go over a few points, and then Ben, I know simply based on what we were just discussing there and your most recent paper that you published, you're going to have a lot here. And so, okay, I think we would all agree that evolution does contradict science. It contradicts the Bible. Can random mutations provide the raw material for common descent? Because as we were discussing earlier, yeah, that's what most evolutionists, especially naturalistic evolutionists, would argue, that mutations are random. The mechanisms of evolution, therefore, like natural selection, which I argue is just a fine-tuning mechanism that keeps a species as strong as it can be, very limited, can't even see most nearly neutral mutations. Anyways, and genetic drift. They work with random variation that's generated through mutations. I would argue deleterious mutations over time, so not necessarily beneficial variation. So now that he's saying that God controlled the process and mutations are non-random because nothing really is random, that's very interesting, because as we were saying earlier, your so-called best arguments for evolution, like shared pseudogenes, shared endogenous retroviruses, shared viral DNA, the nested hierarchical pattern of distribution that you see in these so-called genetic mistakes or markers, that in many ways goes out the window. So I'd be interested to see Redeem Zoomer attempt to make a scientific case for common descent. I don't see any of Redeem Zoomer's initial points establishing a reality where God controlled the evolutionary process. We know God doesn't control things that are false, such as common descent. So it's more of an assertion that Redeem Zoomer needs to prove or demonstrate. If he controlled that imaginary process, then we should find good evidence for it. Now, I like to point out that, okay, there is a lot of observations and data that we have that both the creation and evolution models can explain, right? I mean, the sky is blue, therefore creation's true. No, I mean, the evolutionary model could explain the same thing. Basic homology, shared structures in the biological world. Evolutionists would look to descent with modification as an answer to that. We would look to common design. Point is, we want to look to discriminating data. So that's what I mean by evidence only for common descent. I'd want to see Redeem Zoomer, and this is what we should find if God controlled that process. We should find many discriminating lines of evidence for common descent that only common descent can explain. But the fact is, we actually find many discriminating points in favor of creation that actually preclude evolution. The last point I'll make, and then we'll hand it to Ben and then Sam and Praise and get our thoughts here. I would say that yes, certain events, such as Joseph's brothers selling him into slavery, those can be evil. Can be viewed as evil, but that doesn't mean good can't come from them, right? Good things happen to those that love God and follow after him. Did God cause Joseph's brothers to sin against him? Well, for one, that would take us into probably a lengthy debate on the question of determinism, which we've had here many times. But I think the point is that evil can happen, bad things can happen, but God could take those bad things and utilize them for good and utilize them in a way that will serve his purpose, fulfill his purpose. So those are my first initial responses to the first couple minutes there. Ben, what are your thoughts, brother?
Yeah, this is the part of the video where he makes my argument for me when he says mutations are not truly random. Does he mean that? Does he mean they are not truly random? Which implies that the theory that appeals to them is not true. I just think that argument is so powerful that I don't know. I mean, we can talk about a lot of other stuff, but until someone responds to that, I can't take their position very seriously. But one thing you mentioned there is is an argument that evolutionists make in favor of common descent that I talked about in my paper, where they have to assume a random model of mutations in order for their argument to be evidence for common descent. Okay, and so when two, what's that? I heard somebody.
I think that was just feedback from someone.
Okay.
You're good, but
when two DNA sequences differ at a position, okay, at some point it's assumed that the ancestral sequence of both, if they believe a priori that they're descended from the same ancestor, right? It's assumed that the ancestral sequence common to both mutated in one sequence but not the other, and that accounts for the difference in the sequence. Okay, but suppose that the different sequences have different functions. So if there's a reason for the sequence in one species to be different than the sequence in another species, then a design explanation works equally well. God made them with different sequences because they had different functions, and he needed them to perform slightly different functions. Okay, and there's many reasons why that might be the case. So what evolutionists have to do to prefer the common descent explanation over the common design explanation is to argue that when you look at non-functional differences, that's now the evidence that they want to appeal to. So in order to differentiate between what are non-functional sequences and what are functional sequences, they exclude from their analysis sequences that they deem to be under selection. That means that they think the difference in the sequence is functional because it was selected for its function. Okay, that's in evolutionary speak. That's what they're talking about. When they say a sequence is under selection, they mean it's a functional difference. Okay, and so the way that they exclude those from the analysis is by a statistical comparison, which in the end assumes the random model of mutations as the null hypothesis. Okay, that mutations are just generated randomly, but statistically, we can use these mathematical techniques to determine which sequences are actually under selection because they're not random, right? And so they have to compare it to the randomness of the initial generation of the mutation to say that these mutations are not under selection, and therefore they're non-functional, and therefore this is evidence for common descent. Okay, so the random assumption, the assumption that mutations are random with respect to their position in a DNA sequence is fundamental to very important arguments for common descent. And if you believe that God controls everything, then those mutations are not truly random, then you believe the theory is false. Okay? So you can't get around that with fast talk and, funny looking cartoons. That's a logical, philosophical problem that is that goes back to the very first law of logic, that something cannot be both A and not A in the same sense at the same time. Okay, so you need to, in your own mind, differentiate between what you're saying about the doctrine of creation and what you say about evolutionary theory. They can't be true in the same sense. Okay, otherwise you're violating the law of non-contradiction. I could say all kinds of stuff more, but
I mean, no, those are some great points. Those are excellent points. Sam, any thoughts? Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I don't know that I can really add much to that, but yeah, it seems like he would have to now argue for a type of intelligent design, not evolution in the traditional sense.
Yeah,
I've seen some like inspiring philosophy. He's argued and other theistic evolutionists that basically if you were to rewind the tape and redo the evolutionary process over again, because it's non-random or determined, it would all turn out to be the same. We would eventually get humans, and we would have biological life ordered in the same way that we see today.
Really? IP says that?
I think so.
That's interesting. Because most evolutionists just flat out disagree with that. In fact, I think Stephen Jay Gould has said many times in writing that if you replayed the half.
I think we lost you there for about 3 seconds, Ben, but you are back. Could you
I think
maybe
I saw
reiterate
that. So all I was saying was that Stephen Jay Gould, evolutionary biologist at Harvard for a long time, has publicly written and said that if you replayed the tape of history, evolution would result in something different. Something different would happen. And so he's directly, most evolutionary biologists would agree with that. So they directly contradict what apparently Michael Jones is saying about it.
Yeah, I remember hearing him elaborate on that position in a debate years ago. So don't quote me on that. You know, if IP's listening and thinks to himself, I never said that or I don't believe it, then, you know, I'm remembering incorrectly. But I do know there are theistic evolutionists that hold to that position where you basically rewind the tape and it would end up being exactly what we see today. So, okay, Ben, Sam, great points. Praise, anything you wanted to add to that, brother, before we move on to the next section?
Yeah, I just think that the model of creation that is in the Bible, I don't see how, to me, that it's theistic. So it's like, if it's theistic, we expect something personal, God intervening, rather than like this deistic approach with evolution. I think it's oxymoronic, and I would say it's not logically sound, like what Ben was saying. But that's something to think about. More deistic, I think, is evolution.
Yeah, just one more point about the all that stuff about whether if you replayed the tape. That's clearly implied by Redeemed Zoomer's view that if God controls everything, if you replayed the tape, the same exact things would happen.
Right.
The problem, like, you can believe that. That's fine. But if you're asking the question, can we reconcile evolutionary theory as it exists in the scientific literature, as it is defended by scientists, okay? Can we reconcile that with the Christian doctrine of creation? You need to apprehend and deal with what evolutionary theory actually is. You can't change it because you think it's required theologically, okay? You need to deal with evolutionary theory as you claim to defend it. That is
change
Darwinian.
it to fit your needs.
Right? So you can believe some scenario where God controls everything and guides all the mutations and all of that. That's fine, but that's not what evolutionary theory is. Okay? So evolutionary theory is not what you believe, if that's the case. And you're not really defending it. That's the final point I wanted to make, and that's the main point that we make when we talk about these random mutations stuff, because if you think that's compatible with a deterministic view of the history of life, you're mistaken.
Yes, I think that position leads to some major philosophical and theological problems and challenges where I've seen responses that are simply just unconvincing to skeptics. For example, I watched a discussion, not all of it, but a good portion of it, between John Lennox and Alex O'Connor. And he was bringing up some good challenges, as in Alex O'Connor, prominent atheist, asking why? Okay, if God directed the evolutionary process, if both evolution and the Bible is true, one could say, okay, maybe there's a God, but it certainly doesn't seem to be the God of the Bible. You have millions of years of death, extinction, disease to eventually bring forth man. And then when is man infused with a soul to where he's made in the image of God, and that one man within a population of, 10 to 30,000 hominins? Does that mean that one hominin that is the lucky man who now has the ability to receive salvation and regeneration? What about his family members? What about his parents, his grandparents? What about his wife? There's so many problems there, because even evolutionists admit that populations evolve, not individuals. So you have this one individual in this larger population of hominins who's apparently infused with a soul. And I get there's different viewpoints within the theistic evolution position, but there's just a lot of philosophical problems with that I don't think the theistic evolutionists have really good answers for. Okay, gentlemen, let's move on to the next section here. Very good, very thorough. Praise. Hit that play button, brother.
Will still make a lot of biblical objections we need to address. Genesis 1 says the earth was made in 6 days, but we have to ask what day means here. Moses, who wrote Genesis 1, also writes in Psalm 90 that a day for the Lord is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. At least that's how Peter interprets Moses in 2 Peter. The Bible and modern science teach us time is relative. After all, the ancient Near Eastern culture that produced Genesis had a much more flexible concept of time, because they didn't have clocks like we do. A day for them wasn't defined by this idea of 24 hours, it was defined by the sun, which wasn't visible in the sky until the 4th day. So it doesn't make sense to say that the days in Genesis are literal 24-hour Earth days. If you have a more flexible definition of day, then Genesis 1 lines up beautifully with the biological timeline of when things developed on Earth. First, light became visible on Earth, then the Earth was covered in water, then volcanic action made dry land appear, then photosynthetic life cleared the sky so you could see the sun, moon, and stars. Remember, the Bible doesn't say the sun, moon, and stars were created on day 4, just that they appeared in the sky on day 4. Science has revealed that before photosynthetic life produced oxygen, the sky was too thick and cloudy to see the sun, moon, and stars. Then the Cambrian explosion produced lots of aquatic life, the water creatures, and after that, mammals formed on land, and then humans formed. Genesis 1 first says God created Adam, or man, but then it says God created Ha-Adam, or the man, which implies first a general creation of human creatures, and then a specific creation of Adam. Some people say God made Adam from the dust, so
okay,
that
maybe
means
let's stop
Adam
it
did
there.
not
There's
come.
kind of a lot. Praise, can you rewind it back just to the beginning of what he was saying on day and yom, because he moved quick there. As you do that, yeah, just rewind it a little bit so we can re-see that. But there's just a lot of assertions here. Like he's kind of telling his story of what he believes, mentioning the Cambrian explosion and then this happened and that happened. But to me, it's in a way begging the question, because he's not really proving his case or demonstrating his case, just a lot of assertions. But anyways, I want to make some points here on the nature of yom and day. And then, Ben, we will hand it to you. And so, saying time is relative does nothing to say that the days in Genesis are anything other than ordinary 24-hour days. We've all debated with old Earth creationists. I mean, the debates has happened, dozens and dozens of times on yom. We know that yom has more than one meaning, but context determines the meaning. And from my understanding, yom modified by a number in the Old Testament always means a literal day. I've seen one, maybe two cases that old Earth creationists like Hugh Ross have brought up, and we could engage those if necessary. But even those, I think, can be interpreted as a literal day. And it's very similar to the word day in English, and how that can have several meanings, right? For example, in my father's day and my grandfather's day, yeah, that would be a period of time. And so that would be a non-literal usage of the word day. But we need to figure out in scripture and in our everyday use of the word day, if based on the context, if it's being used literally or non-literally. But in Genesis, it's clear that we have the word day being used in a literal sense. Yom's very tightly constrained. It either means the light portion of a day or a 24-hour day. but never used as a period of time. I've seen old earth creationists like Hugh point to Genesis 2:4 to say that that's a period of time. There's a couple different positions in the world of young earth creation. I've heard some young earth creationists that say that Genesis 2:4 could be referring to the day in which God created, as in day one, the first day, or just the entire week in general. But that word Genesis 2:4, it's actually a different use of yom. It's bayom. And so that could refer to the entire creation week. But you can't just import into that text long periods of time into that word. It is a different word than yom. And so that would be my thoughts on that. I do have a couple slides I wanted to cover, but we'll get into that a little bit later, because I do want to get some of your initial thoughts there, Ben.
Yeah, my first thought is very similar to what I talked about when we talked about inspiring philosophy in, I think, December. Old earthers love to claim this day is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years is as a day thing. It refers to the day in Genesis 1 when it clearly does not. As you said, the term day can have different meanings depending on context. And the day is as 1,000 years issue refers to the way day is used in Genesis chapter 2, not Genesis chapter 1. Why? Because when God says to Adam about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he says, on the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. And then from Genesis chapter 5, we find that Adam lives 930 years. Or is it 950? I can't remember. I think it's 930. Noah is 950. But the issue refers to the issue of, why did God say that Adam will die in the day that he eats of the fruit of the tree that he wasn't supposed to eat of? Why didn't he die in that day? Why did he die, 900 and some years later? That's what the issue is referring to. So whatever you think about that, that's okay. Okay. That's another issue. That's not about the days in Genesis 1. Moses in Psalm 90 and Peter in 2 Peter 3 are not referring to the days in Genesis 1. Bottom line. Okay. This is a different context. It is a different issue. It has nothing to do with the days of creation.
Yeah, Ben, were you still talking? I'm not sure if your mic cut out or not.
No, I'm fine.
Okay. Well, let me make a point, and you're welcome to push back on it a little bit too. I mean, there's arguments that the word day there, referring to Adam, you shall surely die, would actually be both, because he didn't die physically, but spiritually, there are many that would say that he died spiritually in that moment on that day. So I'm not sure that, I mean, what do you think about that?
I mean, that's one possible interpretation. I've used that interpretation before. I was really just more making the point that old earthers want to apply this to the word day in Genesis 1 when that's not the issue. And Donny was just saying that these words can mean different things in different contexts. And you can't take the way that the word day is used in Genesis 2 and claim that all these arguments are about the word in Genesis 1. It's not the same context. But as to what that really means, I actually think that there's a, and this is, I think, the CMI answer, Creation Ministries or creation.com answer, is that there's a Hebrew phrase in that verse towards the end that is something like mot demot or something, and mot is death. And so the word death, the root word for death, is used twice. And it's in this sort of weird Hebrew construction. I actually did a sort of very introductory Hebrew class last semester, and I happened to find a similar construction in Isaiah chapter 6, where he says, seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear. And what my professor at Biola told me, who is an old earther, told the class that the reason, this construction denotes not a temporal sense of meaning, but rather a sense of certainty that something will happen. Okay. And so when it says in Genesis 2, I think it's verse 22 or something like that, verse 20, when he says, on the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. The literal translation there is something like, on the day that you eat of it, dying you shall die. And that there's not a good translation to English here, but essentially what it means is this will certainly happen. And so I think the best way to interpret that verse is to say, on the day that you eat of it, you will begin to die, or you will ensure your eventual death, or something like that. I think that's a perfectly acceptable interpretation of that verse. And so I think the term day there probably does mean when, or in the time that you eat of it, but it's talking about a specific time. When you eat of the fruit of the tree, you will begin to die, and it will certainly happen that you will die because you ate of it. So that's a case of where it's a very difficult thing to translate into English. It's a very strange Hebrew phrase there that, because it's a dead ancient language, it's hard to know exactly what it means, but it's a participle use of a verb, and which you can mean all sorts of different things. And but I think what my professor said is you use context to interpret it. And so the context suggests that God didn't mean that you will die in that exact day physically, that he meant something along the lines of, it is certain that you will die once you eat of it.
Yeah, I think those are some good points. I think with many scriptures that there are dual applications, or a couple possible different ways to look at it that maintain the young earth creation position. And that's one of them. I think it's mot to moot is the Hebrew phrase that, in the day that you eat of the tree, you will begin to die. And I think that is true. You will begin to die physically. I like eschatology, and so I do like to point to that verse as one of the first instances of a dual prophecy where you have an immediate fulfillment. When they ate from that tree, they died spiritually. That's one way you could look at it. But it's a dual prophecy because with almost all prophecies, you got that immediate or near fulfillment, and then you got something in the future that's more dramatic, something more literal. And so in the future, Adam and Eve did die physically. So there's your literal fulfillment, spiritual death followed by eventual physical death. You can look at it that way. I think both in a way work, but certainly not an issue for the young earth creation position. I did have a couple more points I wanted to make on Yom. I noticed a comment here that I thought was funny. It was an old earth creationist, Des Capital. He says, Redeem Zoomer and Inspiring Philosophy are wrong about theistic evolution. Yes, they are. But you guys are wrong about young earth creation. Well, that's an assertion. And we will go over some irrefutable lines because there are so many lines of evidence, gentlemen, as you would, I'm sure, agree. And I know you would, Ben. I've seen you discuss it. There are so many lines of evidence for young earth creation that we could pick from, but we could easily pick 3 or 4 that are just irrefutable, where we've seen all of the possible counters and they don't work, right? C14 in diamonds, helium in zircon crystals, the soft tissue in collagen, and red blood cells that we find in dinosaur fossils, genetic degeneration, mutation accumulation, molecular clocks. We can go over so many pieces of evidence that the old earth creationists have attempted, even your best old earth creationists, but they've failed. And so the science really does in many ways preclude the billions of years paradigm. But anyways, we'll get more into that a little bit later when necessary, some of the science. So I have a couple points I want to make on day, but before I do, Sam, I wanted to give you the opportunity if there is anything that you wanted to add here on what's being discussed, brother.
Yeah, I have quite a few points on day also. And so what do you want to do? You want me to make one and then go back and forth, or what? I've got a few, and I also have a nice quote that I found I'd like to share.
Okay,
So-
you know what? Okay, I'll show my slides then real quick, and then we'll give it to you, and you just take your time, brother. You go over all those points. I know you got some good stuff. I like to leave no stone unturned and show that there's really no other way to interpret this. Now, Ben, on these debates, when it comes to the scriptural positions, theistic evolutionists, day age, obviously we're young Earth creationists, other positions within the ancient Near Eastern world, aren't there some like Michael Heiser, Dennis Lamoureux, perhaps John Walton? I know even Inspiring Philosophy, because he looks a lot to those guys, where they would even admit, possibly William Lane Craig, but again, I know you know more about this than I do. Don't some of those teachers reject arguments from Hugh Ross where they try and say, well, day means something other than a 24-hour day? They admit that those arguments don't work. They hold to the 24-hour day reality in Genesis, but they just say that it's temple inauguration. And so it is 24 hours, but it's got a more symbolic or deeper meaning. Would that be accurate, Ben?
Yeah, it's absolutely accurate. So John Walton thinks that the days are literal 24-hour days. They're just separated by long periods of time. William Lane Craig thinks the days are 24 hours, and he has a long section in his book, blanking on the name. This one, In Quest of the Historical Atom. He has a long section just flatly arguing against Hugh Ross by name, that Hugh Ross is wrong about this, and the days mean 24 hours. Now, Craig thinks it's a mythical story, right? That's not historically true. So he can say that without being a young Earth creationist. There's lots of different views like that. The Days of Proclamation view, I think, is similar to Walton's view. But yeah, so they're not all agreed on this.
Right. So in a way, we are countering some of the compromise positions, but there are others that would agree that what you typically get from old Earth creationists like Hugh Ross and Reasons to Believe, they would even reject that. I heard, and we responded recently, you probably saw it too, Ben, William Lane Craig on the flood, he argued that the flood account in Genesis is clearly global. It's clearly worldwide. It's not local. So he rejects the local flood interpretation or the local flood apologetics from old Earth creationists like Reasons to Believe. But he just interprets it in a different way, obviously, because he doesn't think it's compatible with science. He thinks science refutes a worldwide flood. So there are people who are non-young Earth creationists who don't buy into these really just, in my opinion, weak apologetics coming from old Earth creationists. But anyways, I'll quickly go over this, and then Sam, I'm curious to see your notes, brother. So a very common passage, when you actually dig into the context of it, it leaves no question. Clearly 24-hour days, young Earth creation, right in the Bible, Exodus 29, verse 9, 6 days thou shalt labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath. You can read it yourself, but verse 11 is what I want to focus on. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is. That includes humans, everything, all of life, and rested the seventh day. Okay, the context of verse 11, so looking at the previous verses, right? You always want to look at the previous verses and also the verses after, indicates ordinary days. If this passage really meant anything other than ordinary days, and this is a point I find very interesting, God could have used another word or other phrases too. There's a word olam, which indicates a long period of time. Why didn't he use that word? He didn't. In addition to olam, there are other Hebrew words that could have easily been used to indicate a duration of time longer than 24-hour days. For example, there's Hebrew words and phrases that could mean to the 1,000th generation, thousands of myriads of years. He didn't use those either. The context would also be different if it meant longer periods of time, but it's not. And I think it's just very important to note that God speaks with precision in his word. believe all the Bible, not just some of it. God was not saying work 6,000 years or work millions of years and then rest one or rest 1,000 years. No, he literally meant work for 6 days, rest one, because that's how he created the heavens and the earth. Very easy, very simple. Context dictates that. The underlying Hebrew dictates that. And there could have been other words and phrases used, but guess what? They weren't. So anyways, Sam, over to you, brother.
Thanks. Yeah, so one thing he said is that he says that a day is defined by the sun, but it's actually a rotation around a point. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be a sun. You could imagine removing the sun and placing an apple there. You would still have a day, or there doesn't have to be anything there. You could just have a point. You could remove the apple and have nothing there, and it would be just a rotation around a point. That's actually what defines a day. So you don't need the sun there at all. He goes on to say that because the sun was not visible for the first few days, that therefore the idea of a day is unintelligible. But this is problematic because we believe that Noah wrote, Moses wrote this, and he understood what a day was. And so when it was revealed by God, the way that he created these things, it was revealed to somebody who understood what a day was. So I don't think that point right there is going to work. He says Genesis was not written on the days of creation. Yeah, it was revealed to an author, possibly Moses, who had full comprehension of what a day was. And then the last point would just to be redundant about what you pointed out, and I guess add further context that's what God wrote with his hand and revealed to Moses physically on a tablet. And so that's what they're going to have to argue against here, as if it wasn't bad enough. Do you guys want to add anything to that? And then I do have one more quote.
Ben, anything you want to interact with there, brother?
Yeah, I think Sam's totally correct about the thing about what he said about the sun. It depends on the rotation of the earth, not the sun, right? And all you need is a fixed point, you know. But one thing I would add is this is the typical Hugh Ross view that the earth, the sun and moon and stars were created before the earth in the Big Bang model. And so this is a problem with Genesis 1, because Genesis 1 has the sun, moon, and stars being created after the earth. And so, you know, people like Hugh Ross and Redeemed Zoomer here want to say that the account in Genesis 1 is fully compatible with the mainstream evolutionary account or cosmological evolutionary account, but it's not. And so they have to engage in these sort of rescue devices to pretend that it does. And the rescue device that Hugh Ross uses is that on day 4, the sun, moon, and stars began to be visible from a hypothetical observer on the surface of the earth. And so the point that I would make simply is that the rest of the passage doesn't make sense if you're trying to think about it from the perspective of a hypothetical earthbound observer. This passage is clearly written from God's point of view. He has a universal vision of the whole universe, the whole world, all at once, and that's how he's talking about what he's doing in creation. He's not talking from the perspective of some hypothetical human before humans were created on the surface of the earth, and the sky is cloudy, so I can't see the sun, moon, and stars. Like that's a rescue device. It's very difficult to interpret the rest of the passage that way. For example, how does a single observer on the surface of the earth know that the waters have been separated from dry ground on the whole earth on day 2, or that God has filled the seas with living creatures? You know, he sees the seas, he sees the land, he sees everything. It's not compatible with Hugh Ross's interpretation of that. But that's because it's a rescue device. It's a way of twisting the text to fit something that you believe for non-textual reasons.
Ben, very good. Praise. I know you had something to say about light as well, brother. Go ahead.
Yeah, it just seems like the Hugh Ross camp, and maybe it looks like he's probably aligned with them, that, you know, it's this post hoc, ad hoc interpretation of light, like it's natural light. I don't know if people know this. There's a direct article and particle in Genesis 1:4. It's like, this is the light. It's only used one other time in the whole Old Testament, and it's in Psalms and talking about God, that God is the light. So I do think that they need to address that this post hoc stuff that they add into their science. It's almost like they're reading scripture through the lens of their modern scientific views, and you just can't do that with an ancient text, a Hebrew text like that. That's all.
Yeah, a lot of them will pretend that they read the Bible in an unbiased manner and they got billions of years out of it. No, there's no way you're going to get billions of. I've heard them look to passages that use the word ancient. That must mean millions of millions of years. I mean, we talk about ancient Rome, ancient China, ancient Greece. You know, these ancient civilizations were not millions and billions of years ago. Something can be, you can have an ancient mountain or an ancient civilization that was just a couple thousand years ago. But I think those are great points. I wanted to screen share here basically and reiterate a couple of them, because it's a common argument. And so, as you gentlemen iterated, all it takes, that this is from CMI. I think Dr. Sarfati has some good material on this. All it takes to have a day-night cycle is a rotating Earth and light coming from one direction. Thus, we can deduce that the Earth was already rotating in space relative to the light created on day one. But I wanted to focus on Revelation 21:23. And so in the city, in the new heaven and new earth, there's going to be no need of the sun, neither of the moon, to shine in it. For the glory of God did enlighten it. Jesus is the light of the world, and the Lamb is the light thereof. And so I also find it interesting, Ben, you've probably noticed the same thing since you've written articles on this topic, but it's a lot of the same repeated arguments that we've seen over the years that have been debunked. I mean, I have Dr. Sarfati's book, Refuting Compromise, and he goes into, you, I think you have it behind you. Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of these arguments have been demolished. And so to just put out this video, but not even attempt, at least from what I can see here, to interact with possible objections. Is this just confirmation bias? Like they're just trying to, confirm in many ways the idea that they've chosen to hold to, rather than young Earth creation?
Yeah, it's some bad form of reasoning. It's difficult to do that kind of psychoanalysis, but I've talked with people like Redeem Zoomer a lot. I've studied William Lane Craig's views a lot, and I absolutely think they go into it with an a priori belief that is based on the mainstream scientific view. Because, I mean, I don't know as much about Redeem Zoomer. He seems like an intelligent guy, but you can't say William Lane Craig is stupid. You can't say that he doesn't understand rational argumentation. Okay, he's an expert on that very thing, if there's anybody who's an expert on it. So he, above all people, and IP is, I think he's in a PhD philosophy program, right? Or is he graduated or something? I don't know. But you can't say they don't understand good argumentation. But all of a sudden, when it comes to this issue, all of a sudden they're making terrible arguments. Why? I don't claim to know why, but I think it's cultural. We live in a culture that there's a huge pressure from the education system, from popular media, from very smart people in academia to accept this. So I think that is what explains it ultimately.
I find it to be frustrating in many ways that what I've seen from a lot of these theistic evolutionists is a lack of being up to date, because you were talking about earlier, Ben, that today we do have a lot of good arguments against evolution. We model build, like we actually have some really good models right now, especially because of genetics and a lot of the research that groups like the RATE team have done. For example, Dr. Russell Humphreys on the helium and zircon. crystals, where he's actually published a paper. And I brought this up in my most recent debate. And the interlocutor at that moment didn't know how to address it. But in his paper, he literally showed from science that the Earth is somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years. Like, it can't be any more older than that because of the helium that we still find in the zircon crystals. But especially in the world of genetics, these models that we've built, these arguments that we have for a literal Adam and Eve, from my experience at least, a lot of these theistic evolutionists that put out these kinds of videos, in many ways, critiquing young Earth creation, they're not aware of some of our best arguments. So that tells me they're not up to date. Matt, my ministry partner on X, he'll oftentimes ask militant critics against young Earth creation to name one prediction that a young Earth creationist has made. And we've made many, and they can't name one. So, I mean, are they even informed enough to be, critiquing young Earth creation the way that they are?
No, and young Earth creationists complain about this all the time. It's not just us here. I've heard many of them, the guys with PhDs at ICR and other places, AIG, they complain about this. These guys come out and publicly say we're crazy and stupid, but they never actually read any of their papers. They never read any of their books. Most of the critiques that pass for critiques of young Earth creationism in old Earth circles are just taken directly from Hugh Ross's view. And Hugh Ross is famous for misrepresenting young Earth creationism. He does all these kinds of things where he says, well, young Earth creationism entails this, and then he gives some ridiculous result or something, and therefore they're wrong. But no one ever asked the young Earth creationists what they think.
Right.
Entailment is a philosophical thing. It doesn't really apply to science in that way. So it's like saying, well, this other guy's view leads to this absurdity. It's literally a straw man argument is what it is. And Hugh Ross does this all the time. And he refuses to ever correct any of his views.
Right.
And everybody takes it from him.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to read our literature either. And so they just use his arguments, and that's what they do.
His arguments have been debunked, not only in article and book form, but in live debate. I mean, I just recently in preparation for this, Sam, I think you're familiar with this debate over on Revealed Apologetics, I think is the name of it. Jason Lyle versus Hugh Ross.
Yeah, that's right.
And the first hour is focusing on the scripture, and Dr. Lyle he corrected Hugh Ross on every point. And I'm sitting there waiting for Hugh Ross to rebut Jason Lyle's points on Yom and his old Earth scriptural arguments. And he didn't rebut. And then the second hour, they got into distant starlight, and Dr. Lyle completely demolished Hugh Ross's arguments, and Hugh Ross had no good response. It's not like his arguments haven't been addressed. They've been addressed in many ways, but yet they're still repeated. Like you said, Ben, Hugh Ross does not correct himself, which is why these types of rebuttal videos are pretty easy to interact with. But anyways, we could probably go down and discuss that for many more hours, but perhaps we should move on. Praise, I was curious.
I do have one.
Yes, Sam, go ahead, brother. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm reading this book right here, and it's called The First 6 Days by a guy named Douglas Hamp.
Can you hold that up again?
I'm about two-thirds of the way through, and he's actually challenging Hugh Ross on his invocation of the early church fathers agreeing that the earth is old. And so that's a problem here. But there's this one quote I thought was good. I'd like to share. This is by an Old Testament scholar, Gordon Weeman, states that there can be little doubt that here a day has its basic sense of a 24-hour period. He is echoed by Oxford Hebrew.
Oh, I think Sam may have paused or froze this time. Are you guys seeing that as well?
Yeah.
Okay, Sam, we'll give you an opportunity
professor of Hebrew.
He's back. Hey, Sam, before you continue, you froze for maybe 8 to 10 seconds. So if you
Perfect.
could rewind and restate what you're saying.
Yeah. So, okay. So Oxford Hebrew professor James Barr, who does not actually believe in Genesis, but states emphatically regarding the writer's intent that creation days were 6 literal days. He later adds in 1984 letter, there is no professor of Hebrew or Old Testament in any world-class university who does not believe that the writers of Genesis intended to convey creation took place in 6 days, and then the affirmation of the genealogies and Noah's flood. Now, sure, he might not be aware of somebody. And of course, I'm not saying that it's true because he said it, but that's a powerful statement to make as recent as 1984 from a somebody who knows and is educated in the topic. So that's why I wanted to share that.
Very good. Praise, can you rewind, please, if you don't mind? Because I want to make sure we're addressing everything. Timestamp 204.
90, that a day for the Lord is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. At least that's how Peter interprets Moses in 2 Peter.
Okay. Gentlemen, did we address that one? We've been moving quick.
Yeah, I did briefly.
Yeah, because here's another funny one that's brought up. And again, in Genesis, like I said, the word yom is tightly constrained. And I just wanted to go over a couple slides I made here because I've read many responses on 2 Peter 3:8, but I think Dr. Lyle and Chafee have some good points here that I wanted to cover. And so they say, if this is supposed to offer support for the old earth creationist view, it is difficult to see how it can. For example, and this part's funny. If this is a mathematical equation, so let's just say, okay, that these days here do mean more than, as in going with their logic, because we understand. I mean, God's basically just saying, because you got scoffers that are saying, where is the promise of his coming? It's been a couple thousand years. He's still not here yet. And God is saying, hey, a couple thousand years is meaningless. He wishes that all would come to repentance. Okay, God's outside time, matter, and space. And a couple thousand years might seem like a long time to us. But to God, a day is as 1,000 years. 1,000 years is as a day. It does nothing to contradict or counter what's clearly being said in Genesis. But anyways, if we were to go with their logic, that's what I'm trying to say, okay? And here's what Jason Lyle and Tim Chafee say. Then the equation would be 1 day equals 1,000 years equals a day. But no old earther believes the creation period was 6,000 years long. So basically you got 6,000 years. And then we got about 6,000 years since creation based on the genealogies. And that is pretty clear. Okay, so what, you got a 12,000 roughly year old universe? Does any old earth creationists believe that? No. So even going with their logic, this doesn't work. It says it would not help him harmonize Genesis. I think that's specifically to Hugh Ross with the billions of years of evolutionary geology and cosmology. Here they say, second, this quote is found in a passage dealing with the future return of Christ. It is simply indicating that God is not bound by time. Although it may seem like a long time to man, God is not neglecting his promise. So when a scoffer comes, like we see today, where is Jesus? You've been saying he's going to be coming back for a couple thousand years. There's a reason for that. He will send Christ back on his own timetable, not ours. So I just wanted to go over those couple slides. Gentlemen, did you want to reiterate or add anything to that before we move on?
Well, yeah, I mean, just the sequential laws. You have and this, and this, and this, and the next day. I mean, that's a historical narrative. And they're going to have to try to make it allegorical or figurative, and that's just ridiculous.
Since we have a couple young earth or old earth creationists in real time, and we're doing this live, I want to put a challenge out here while we continue with the video. Okay, we could go over many lines of evidence. Des Capital, tell us, I want to see a good reason for why we find C14, which has a short half-life. If every single atom in the universe was made of radiocarbon, it should have all decayed away in easily 100,000 years. Okay, but yet we find C14 in just about everything in the geologic, so-called geologic column. We find C14 in diamonds, coal, fossils. Diamonds are the hardest substance on Earth. They should be resistant to contamination. Again, the half-life of C14 is so short that we should not be finding C14 in diamonds that are claimed to be billions of years old. And so that puts a time limit. That restrains that restricts, I should say, the age of the Earth. So Des, as we continue here, since you're an old Earther, we appreciate you being here. Provide in the live chat a good answer to that. Hopefully it's not contamination. Hopefully it's something that's not easily debunked. And then we'll address it for you. Okay, Praise, continue, brother.
One more quick point, because I think kind of everything hinges on this one also. Point that Ben didn't make it a point, but he did bring it up, that let's just grant, for the sake of argument, these long periods of time as the days. Does that actually solve the problem? Because we have the order of creation does not line up with the atheistic view of creation, as far as like the planets and the earth and the plants and those things. They're out of order. So even giving them the time, it's not going to help. And then the last point, I don't really know about this one. This is something that we can look into, but it's the sixth day that God creates the larger beasts and man. So I don't know if we draw it out there on their evolutionary timeline, if there's enough time for all of those things to take place in whatever period of time they're qualifying a day as here. That might be another problem too. It might not.
Very good, Sam. Praise, did you want to continue?
Adam. Some people say God made Adam from the dust, so that means Adam did not come from other creatures. But the Bible says you were made from the dust, but you still had ancestors, so why couldn't Adam have ancestors as well? Science has revealed that the first single-celled life did come from the ground, and everything else is descended from that.
That's an assertion.
Some people ask, what about the image of God? Because if humans gradually evolved from animals, then
I was just saying that this is very prominent throughout this video. Science has revealed that the first like he's just making assertions. Okay, well, show us the evidence for that. So yeah, it's an assertion. We don't need nothing to refute. So anyways, keep going.
At what point did we start being made in the image of God? But we have to ask, is the image of God mainly physical or spiritual? Because if it's physical, well, chimpanzees share 98% of the same DNA as us.
Assertion.
And celery has 50% of the same DNA as us.
I want Redeemed Zoomer to accept a debate. Here's the proposition. Are humans and chimpanzees related through common ancestry? He can do the same thing with us. Debate seminar, 4.5 hours. We can dig deep. I want to see the science, because Ben, we could spend the next 3 hours showing why what he just said is not true. We can get into the Y chromosome dissimilarity, the fact that overall gene content, size differences in architecture, the Y chromosomes are less than 30% the same. Redeem Zoomer, how do you address that? How do you explain all those massive differences? The chimpanzee apparently lost the entirety of its heterochromatic arm. I just debated that a week ago with culture cats. Who knows the science? Even those that know the science don't have answers to these challenges. 98%. Well, Dr. Rob Carter just published an article in CMI covering the recent paper where if you dig into the supplementary material, I've got a couple slides on it for sake of time. I don't think it's necessary, but Redeem Zoomer is going to have to address the fact that 12% of the human and chimpanzee genomes don't even align. And then they got to make excuses and say, well, that's because since the split, there's been structural rearrangements, there's been insertions, there's been deletions, there's been duplication. It's like they're assuming that these mutations even happen. But anyways, Ben, are you seeing a lot of assertions here, and a lot of the assertions not even being backed by science? For example, like this claim here, 98% with chimps.
Yeah, for sure. And in another video he did a while ago on the same topic, he says, and it's almost a quote, that I examined the scientific evidence for Darwinian evolution and found it to be conclusive.
Yeah, right.
He says he examined it and found it to be conclusive. But then he never makes any scientific arguments. He never presents any of the evidence that he supposedly studied. Okay. I'm frankly skeptical that he has studied this at any level deeper than, a Google search or something like that.
Right.
But yeah, so there was this whole thing for many years about Jeffrey Tompkins's work on this 99% similarity number. It turns out he did make a few mistakes. And Robert Carter sort of admitted that and has talked about it publicly. But now there's some better data coming out, including a chimpanzee genome that is not based on the human genome like the previous ones were. So, of course, if you base it on the human genome, it's going to come out looking like the human genome. But they did a raw, really good sequencing of the chimp genome. And even an evolutionary biologist named Richard Buggs has come out and saying, yeah, this number is much lower than 98%. And he's been saying that for a long time. I think Carter's article refers to Buggs. But a big problem was, for a very long time, evolutionists were simply excluding certain sequences from the analysis entirely. Why? Because their BLAST program or whatever program they were using to compare the sequences couldn't align them at all. And so they say, well, that's not in the analysis because, it's meaning, and part of the assumption is that it's meaningless repetitive DNA. It doesn't have any meaning or it doesn't do anything, right? And so they say, well, we're just excluding that from the analysis. But the reason why it couldn't align at all is because it was so different that they couldn't align it. And so they were only comparing the sequences that actually they could align using their programs. So they were comparing the sequences that were most similar between chimps and humans, and not the ones that were most dissimilar. It's like, and Tompkins made the point a long time ago that the chimp genome is 10% larger than the human genome. So doesn't that mean it's at least 10% different? Like, just common sense. Why are they sticking to this 98% number? It's because they want to persuade the public of evolution. And they see correctly that in a public PR setting, a public relations setting where most people, like probably Redeemed Zoomer himself, simply doesn't understand the science behind it, that this 98% number looks really impressive and evidence or even proof that we have a common ancestor. That's why they like this number and they defend it so stringently. It's not because they care about science. It's because they care about a narrative that they're pushing out to the public.
Yeah, I'd like to see Redeemed Zoomer explain, even within those similar regions, you find differences in the way those genes are regulated or the way they're expressed. So how did those changes come about since the split, or changes, differences we see in epigenetics or 3D arrangement of the genomes of human and chimpanzees? I mean, he just asserts 98%, but he doesn't get into any significant detail. So here's my challenge to Redeemed Zoomer. If humans and chimpanzees are related and go back to a common ancestor, and excellent points you made there, Ben, well, the Y chromosome, that's uniparentally inherited DNA. It's passed on one side. The father's side is paternally inherited. It lacks, for the most part, recombination. So it's less messy. But yet we know that the observed mutation rate in the Y chromosome is fast. It's about 1 to 3 per generation. Every single male Y chromosome on the planet is nearly identical, low genetic variation. But wait a minute, the mutation rate is fast. Mutations add something because they're adding something that was not previously there. So mutations do add diversity. I'm not saying it's necessarily good diversity, but they do add diversity. So, okay, if we've been accumulating mutations in the Y chromosome for 1 to 200,000 years, Redeemed Zoomer, then why don't we find more genetic variation in male human Y chromosomes? And then when we bring in the chimpanzee, have a look at this visual. The chimpanzee Y chromosome is half the size. So like you were saying, Ben, in terms of whole genome comparison, okay, if the Y chromosome's half the size, well, you're starting at 50%. You're starting at 50%. Notice the color coding here. So you've got the gray, the black. I'll make this easier for people like Redeem Zoomer to see so they can refute it or attempt to refute it. The gray here, that's heterochromatin. That's a densely packed type of DNA, comprises repetitive sequences like satellite DNA. And you'll notice in the chimpanzee Y is totally gone, completely missing. So at some point since the split, the chimpanzee lineage lost the entirety of its heterochromatic arm. And so when you compare overall gene content, size differences, and architecture, the Y chromosomes are less than 30% the same. Bring in the gorilla Y. We're supposed to share a more distant common ancestor with the gorilla. The gorilla Y and the human Y, they're more similar to each other than either are to the chimp Y. Well, there's a break in their so-called nested hierarchy. And again, the Y chromosome should be more clean because it lacks recombination. This scrambling every generation of genetic variants, the chromosomes line up, exchange genetic material, so on and so forth. For the most part, the Y chromosome lacks that. So right here is a very tough challenge for the evolutionary community. How, like he said, he's asserting that humans and chimps are related. How can they be in light of this data? And then what you had mentioned, Ben, on the this new paper here in 2025, over 12% of the human and chimpanzee genomes represent a gap difference. There are many genomic regions that cannot even be aligned. 2024, it's even worse for the evolutionists. Here's human, here's chimp. Scroll up, compare. Less than 30% when you compare everything. Those are some massive differences. And so the whole 98% assertion is just that. It's just an assertion, but I would like to see some evidence for that assertion. Sam, anything you want to add, brother?
Yeah, it's going to be different than that. So he's making a big whopping argument from science when he says that the Bible is made from dust and we have ancestors. Therefore, why couldn't Adam have ancestors? That's an argument from science. Questions aren't arguments. So he's attempting to make an argument from science, but the Bible is not silent. So that's going to be a problem. The Bible does not say that we were formed from the earth. But if you notice, if you go through the creation order, you'll see that God brings
Sam, hold that thought. I just have to address these comments in real time. So Des Capital, unless I missed it, I have yet to see you send in an answer to the C14 challenge. So we'll wait. Secondly, he asserts that I did not address the long-term evolution experiment, Lenski's experiment in the culture cats debate. So I corrected him on that. I said, that's false. I literally spent I still have my notes. I spent 2 minutes showing why Lenski's experiment doesn't work. Actually, Lenski's experiment supports genetic degeneration and genetic entropy because what Lenski demonstrated was reductive evolution. Lenski's E. coli bacteria have shrunk in functional genome size. They're lazy. They're handicapped. So then he accepts correction in a way, but does a slap and run. He says, maybe you are. No, it's not maybe I'm correct. I did the debate. I remember I addressed it for 2 minutes straight. He says, maybe he literally missed that 2 minutes of the string. Yeah, you probably did. It was the rebuttal. And then he says, Katz brought it up again later and he didn't hear a rebuttal. Yeah, he brought it up in his closing. How am I supposed to? It goes me, then him, then Q&A. So the point is, these are the types of things we get from critics. He's not engaging anything. He's making wild assertions. And I just had to call that out, Sam. But anyways, we're still waiting for an answer to the C14 challenge. Sam, continue your thoughts, brother.
I'm not going to hold my breath. And I do wonder, Donny, that Lenski's experiment, are they still E. coli or are they something that's What's going on there?
They're multi-celled organisms now.
Is it special? I had someone tell me, well, it's not an evolutionary experiment. They're not trying to get them to evolve. Well, what are they doing?
Well, they're getting them to devolve
That's
because
right.
they've degenerated significantly.
But yeah, anyway, so we have God calling the fish out of the sea. We've got him creating the bringing forth the grass from the earth. But when it comes to mankind, we see something that's different. That's an intimate relationship. God didn't call mankind from these animals. So there's another hermeneutical problem for them. God created man, a special creation. It was an intimate relationship, and God breathed life into his lungs and took the time to walk and talk with man in the garden. But the point here, though, is that the Bible isn't silent, and that's why the argument from silence, which is fallacious, doesn't work anyway. It's an intimate creation with man. So, yeah, anyone want to comment on that?
Ben?
Just that I don't think several of the arguments he makes here, including this one, are not really, I don't see how they're directly relevant to the age of the earth issue. And the other thing that I would say is that I really hate it when critics say somebody said this and then don't cite who they're talking about, because that is evidence to me, maybe weak evidence, that nobody actually said that, and this is a straw man. Okay, so if someone actually said that, I would like to know who it was so I can go and look it up and see what they actually said, because half the time or more than that, they didn't say what they're being represented as saying by a critic. But if it's somebody like some random person on Facebook, well, you can find anybody saying anything on some random person on Facebook. When you engage in scholarly intellectual debate, or at least intellectually honest debate, you should be addressing the strongest arguments from the most capable defenders of the position you're arguing against. You should not be taking vague statements from the internet or from someone you met at church randomly, or something you literally probably just made up in your head as a possible argument the other side might make. You need to examine our actual arguments, our actual positions, and respond to those.
Yeah, when we're debating, or when I'm specifically debating online with atheists, for example, or non-Christians, it would be nice if they were honest. It would be nice. We kind of expect that a little bit, but I'm not surprised when we catch them just bold-faced lying. And I'm not accusing Redeemed Zoomer of doing that at all. The point that I'm making, though, is that when you're a Christian, you identify as a Christian, then we are obligated by God to be honest and intellectually honest. And if our position has been corrected, then we have to acknowledge those corrections and not repeat, talking points that have been ambiguous, maybe we'll say. So we would expect more from somebody who is a Christian, and from ourselves.
Very good, gentlemen. Excellent points all around. Praise. Feel free to add anything you'd like to contribute, any thoughts, and then we'll move on here to the next section. Praise, you're on mute if you're looking to say anything, and then I think we can continue the video, brother. Praise may have stepped away. Praise, did you step away? Okay, we'll wait for him to come back to press play.
Before we move on, I do have one more thing to say about, is the image of God physical or spiritual? And Redeemed Zoomer makes the point that the image of God is based on a rational soul, which I broadly agree with. And I'm not sure it's super relevant to the argument here, but I doubt that Redeemed Zoomer would argue that the image of God could inhabit a rock or a bacterium as a physical body. Okay. So there are some physical requirements for being a vessel for the image of God, some bodily requirements. And evolution is supposed to be the explanation for how those came to be. So I think there is a little nuance here to this question of the image of God thing. Before I went to ETS last year, I would have said that there might be some theistic panpsychists who could accept that the image of God might be endowed, could be housed by a rock or a bacterium, because panpsychists believe that fundamental particles have at least some element of consciousness. But then I heard this theistic panpsychist there, and even she doesn't defend that position. So everyone believes that there's some physical requirements for a bodily vessel that is as a house or can be inhabited by the image of God, a rational soul. So there is still a question here about how do we get this image of God, this bodily requirement for being a vessel of the image of God.
Yeah, you know what? If praise isn't back, I think
I'm back. Sorry about that.
No worries.
I mean, God, Christ incarnated. I mean, he's literally going to reign and rule, sitting at the right hand in a physical form. What that looks like right now, we believe that it's a physical form of a man. And so then we're going to have to challenge again God's omniscience. Did God know that eventually he was going to incarnate and take on a physical form? And what if you were to unwind it again and roll it forward again, if it's not guided? I mean, could it have been that? Could it have been a snail if it happened again? Or
yeah, and then as here in the image, at what point did these creatures start being made in the image of God? Okay, to the theistic evolutionists like Redeem Zoomer, what was the first human made in the image of God? Which hominid would he look to? Is it Heidelbergensis? Is it Homo sapiens? Is it Erectus? Answer that question. Give me the population number of whatever that hominin was. And they're in a difficult spot. I was debating an old earther in an open mic last week, and he was using Hugh Ross's arguments. And I pressed him on Neanderthals and Erectus and the sophisticated nature of them as to how they were clearly an intelligent people group. And he was arguing that, well, maybe they're the result of, or maybe they're basically the Nephilim, where there's these hybrids, where there's interbreeding going on, just some wild stuff. And I've heard Hugh Ross. I find it funny what they assert, a lot of these old Earth creationists, on that idea, what happened to form Neanderthals and a lot of these hominins. To them, that's not too far-fetched, but young Earth creation, that's too far-fetched, guys. I just find that to be kind of humorous. The heat problem, no, that's too much. But these beasts, these animals like Neanderthals, which, I mean, we have evidence for them burying their dead, tool use, fire use. Obviously, we could talk about that for the next 2 hours. My point here, my challenge to Redeem Zoomer, show me what hominid was made in the image of God, the one that was infused with a soul. Whatever that hominin was, say it was Heidelbergensis, he would have existed in a population of, say, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000, all looking basically like him. So that would have been Adam, the high priest of the garden. I've heard some theistic evolutionists say. So basically now that one hominin, guys, this makes sense. He has the chance for regeneration and salvation, but all his friends and family, everybody that exists with him at that time, nope, they're still animals. They're still beasts. They have no opportunity for salvation. Maybe that hominin had some parents and grandparents. Apparently they don't have the opportunity for salvation. There's just so many weird ideas now that have to be thrown around based on the implications of theistic evolution. But anyways, I just wanted to get that in there. Those are a couple questions. If there's ever a response video, I want to see an answer to those. Praise, feel free to hit play, brother.
What will the image of God be when he comes back? Is it going to be like this primate? here?
Yeah.
Not the image of God? I mean, did God not know?
This may not be super relevant, but Richard Swinburne is a famous Christian philosopher, and he once, under pressure of argument, admitted that he thought that an alligator body could house the rational soul of a human. So, whether that's true or not, it kind of makes it clear, right, that there is something at stake when we talk about the physical body of human beings being the place where our rational soul exists in some way, right? Or
that would be weird, because you've got like a Thomistic understanding of the mind-brain relationship. If the alligator doesn't have a human brain, then will the mind indwell that brain? What would that work? How would that?
Swinburne is going to be the anti-Thomist here, and it would be actually, I would probably be the Thomists who defend the position, the more traditional people who defend the position that the human body is specifically required for us to exist, because they're hylomorphic dualists. So they think that the rational soul is literally just the form of the human body. It is a very strange view, but it is the Thomist view. In other words, it's something about the arrangement of the human body that gives us our soul. So Thomas would very strongly defend that the human body, the way it is required for us to be human. Swinburne is a dualist, so he was saying that our immaterial mind or soul could be connected to any old body. Right?
Like a Cartesian? Is he like more of a Cartesian dualist?
I'm not sure. I don't want to put that label on him, but he's a very he's a dualist of some kind. So
interesting, though.
Gentlemen, excellent point. Praise, go ahead. Unless you had any thoughts.
No, you guys covered it all. Good job.
Okay, go ahead, brother.
Is celery 50% in the image of God? So we need to say the image of God is mainly a spiritual status. This is the traditional interpretation. The image of God is a rational soul.
I don't get what he's saying there, Ben. Is he trying to say that the image of God would be based on our genetic similarity to other organisms? I mean, well, it's also funny that he would believe he's related to celery. That's cute, but Ben, what's he trying to? What's his point here?
I think he's making a straw man argument. He's saying that some objection to evolution is that, well, if evolution is true, wouldn't chimps, because they're 98% genetically similar, be 98% the image of God? And so he's smacking down a straw man argument, which is why it doesn't make sense, because no one who made this argument, I don't know. I've never made this argument. I wouldn't even think of it. I don't know why he thought of it.
It's also, it discredits his own argument from genetic level homology with humans and chimps, because the Bible doesn't make any specific prediction about how much in terms of DNA and genetics we're supposed to share with a chimpanzee. It's largely agnostic. Even if we shared 98% with the chimpanzee, who cares? Apparently, according to him, we share 50% with celery. We share 50% with a banana plant. Well, stand afar, look at a chimpanzee, look at a human, and look at celery and a banana plant. We look a lot more similar to a chimp, don't we, than we do a banana plant. So I'm not surprised that we share more, let's say, genetically with a chimp than we do with a banana plant. These are hierarchies by design, not descent. So in a way, I think it removes the argument he was trying to make about homology and genetics. But anyways, I just wanted to ask you that clarifying point, Ben. I appreciate it. Praise, go ahead, brother.
Even if they're structurally very similar. So we went from animals to people in the image of God once we got this rational soul. A long time ago, the Earth was crawling with a bunch of almost human creatures, maybe Neanderthals or other hominids, and God set apart one of them.
They say his argument is a straw man. We as creationists, all these hominins, whether he wants to look at Neanderthals or Heidelbergensis or Erectus or Naledi, I want to know how much he's read on creationist literature discussing hominins. We just did a 5-hour seminar, Ben, with Dr. Peter Line, who I love his work. I greatly appreciate his work on hominins. I think he's one of the best in the world of young earth creation on addressing hominins. And we've given many good arguments showing why Neanderthals are human, Heidelbergensis is human, Erectus, Naledi, Hobbit, so on and so forth. Now, the only ones, they're, Lucy, the Australopithecines. Yeah, they're non-human, but there's a lot of overlap, and that's expected after the Tower of Babel. So it sounded like he tried to say there Neanderthals were not human. What are your thoughts, guys?
Yeah, that's the reasons to believe position. And I think maybe it might be in his other video, his longer video on evolution and the Bible, something like that. I think it's called Does Evolution Contradict the Bible? But anyway, he mentions that he thinks humans began about from 50,000 to 200,000 years ago. And that's the basic reasons to believe model, right? And so that excludes Neanderthals and quite a few others, probably Homo erectus and Heidelbergensis, certainly some of those other ones. But so he is saying that God gave human beings a rational soul somewhere between 50 to 200,000 years ago. And so anything that looks like a human but is prior to that would not have it. Is that what you wanted?
Yeah, I think that's good. I think he's making an argument that would only make sense, that would only work if we as young earth creationists were saying that the majority of hominins, what he are calling creatures, were not human. They're all human, made in the image of God. We have the evidence for that too. Burying their dead, evidence for spirituality. Anyways, Sam, any thoughts, brother?
No, we can move on.
Okay. Go ahead, praise.
Him in the Garden of Eden and gave him the breath of life, which is the rational soul. So he became the first creature to be made in the image of God. And then all his children were also made in the image of God and also had rational souls. So Adam was still truly the first human. Now, if death entered the world through Adam, which the Bible says, then how was there death before the fall of Adam, which evolution says? Well, why couldn't this be true? 2 verses later, it says death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses. But there was still death after Moses, so why not before Adam? The next verse says that grace came through Christ, just like death came through Adam. But the grace won by Christ still chronologically applied to people that came before Christ. So why should the death that Adam brought not chronologically apply to creatures that came before Adam? Remember, God is outside of time. Some people still think the Bible says there was no death before the fall of Adam, but it teaches the opposite.
I wanted to make a couple points on what I think he said earlier. We're moving quickly. I just want to make sure I'm addressing all the points. And then, Ben, we're going to have you tackle this. But so in my notes, I find it funny that when he mentioned the Cambrian explosion, he did that very quickly, just as passed by, but not even realizing that that event demolishes common descent, right? In the Cambrian explosion, there's this sudden appearance of all these major phyla. That includes jellyfish, coral, all of these massively different kinds of organisms with phylum level differences. And where's all the evolutionary change for them? Because although he's saying mutations are non-random, he's still saying that non-random mutations and selection and drift and so on and so forth led to the evolution of these creatures. But yet, no, they exploded into existence. He also mentioned the point about, let me see here, 1 Corinthians 15, 47 to 48, simply referring to the fact that we are physical and we will be raised one day physically in resurrected bodies. And we've also addressed his points on Neanderthals and the so-called genetic homology. So I'm largely up to date on my notes. Ben, did you want to now tackle this point here?
I don't have to, because I'm largely in agreement with the point that he's actually making. I don't think there was death before the fall, but I agree that God is outside of time, and I think that because if God is outside of time, that means he can engage in backwards causation if he wants to, and that's kind of what he's talking about here. God could, if he wanted to, make the effects of the fall occur in the timeline prior to the fall itself. So I don't use this argument that, and in this case, he's not using a straw man. There are many young earthers who make this exact argument that the Bible restricts there being any kind of even possibility of death before the fall. I don't think that's the case, but I don't think there's actual death before the fall. And I also think that some of the things that he did say are weird, because he seems to think that the fruit is similar to like a William Lane Craig's view, is that the fruit is some kind of magic fruit, the fruit from the tree of life, that once you eat of it, you're immediately immortal or something. I think that's what he thinks. And I don't think that's the case at all. I did a whole long video on what I think was going on with fruit, and I think it's something that Adam and Eve would have had to continue eating in order to stay immortal. And so I think they could have easily been already eating from the tree of life, and then as soon as they were kicked out of the garden, they no longer had access to it. They began to die without that source of nutrients that was specially designed for them to live forever. So I think there's nothing magical about this fruit that it grants you immortality or anything. I think there's a perfectly scientific explanation for that. But
yeah, on the tree of life, I put, and then Sam, let's get your thoughts. I noted that perhaps they were created immortal, Adam and Eve, and that the tree of life represented God, Jesus Christ, as the source of eternal life. They possessed immortality, and the tree represented that state that they were in. They had the benefits of eating from this, but when they ate from the tree of knowledge, they lost that immortality. God had to kick them out and guard the tree of life, because no good could come from sinful, fallen, mortal beings eating from a tree that could grant them immortality. And so I guess in many ways that could counter this argument that you've heard, Ben, that says, well, if the tree was required for the immortality, then that means all animals outside of the garden would have basically had to travel to the garden to eat from the tree. We've heard that from Adam Terry. And so, that's one way to look at it. Sam, and any thoughts, brother?
No, I've not. I don't think that I've really thought that through enough. I mean, to talk about that. But just for clarification, but Ben, what you're talking about would be like a retroactive death before the fall. Is that what you mean?
That's what I mean by backwards causation.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting.
I think that's theologically allowable. So he seems to be thinking about death as the possibility of death, meaning mortality as a property of living beings. And I largely agree with that. I don't think there's anything magical about the immortality that Adam and Eve had in the garden. I think that they, in theory, could have died before the fall. They just didn't. And God knew they wouldn't, because he knows, the whole timeline from his position outside it. So and he was in position to prevent it, but he put in a mechanism to prevent them from naturally dying, which was the fruit from the tree of life. That's what I think.
So then would you say animals outside of the garden and possibly in the garden died? Basically death before the fall, not for humans, but for animals? Ben, I'm just trying to understand what you're saying a little more.
Well, it depends on what you mean by an animal. So I doubt that large mammals died before the fall. But bacteria almost certainly did. Plants certainly did. It's certainly God's intention for at least some plants to die because they're being eaten. But plants or animals outside the garden, if they did, it wouldn't matter to me, because I agree that the effects of the fall can be made retroactive, as Sam said, if God wants to. I think the fall happened very quickly.
I'm not sure I fully understand what you mean by retro. Are you saying that because the fall was bound to happen, obviously God knew he wasn't taken by surprise, the effects of the fall were death, and so retroactively, meaning that death could have happened before the fall, but it was still because of the fall itself? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. It would be like those who died before Christ were still saved because of the work that Christ was going to do.
So in a way, it'd be like somebody paying me retroactively for a job, paying me in advance because of the job I'm going to do, but I haven't necessarily done yet. Maybe not quite.
I mean, yeah, I don't know that I don't know that I'd put it that way. It would be like,
I'm not sure I even fully agree with your position. I understand it maintains young earth creation. I'm not, because like the point I made with the tree of life simply representing Jesus Christ and the eternal life that they had, them being immortal. That's one way to look at it without saying that even hypothetically Adam and Eve could have died, or the animals. So I understand what you're saying, Ben. It's an in-house debate and it's an answer that maintains young earth creation, but I'm not sure I'm fully on board with that, which is why I'm just trying to understand your position a little. Yeah.
I'm very unique on taking that view. In fact, I don't know of any other young earther that takes my view particularly. So
let me ask,
maybe the wrong person to ask about this. I don't know.
No, it's good. It's good. We like the discussion. We like, what we like? Multiple working hypotheses. I have Mike Ord on frequently, and we mention that. The importance of multiple working hypotheses. Hey, here's a few different views on the tree of life and death before the fall. Take your pick. Which one do you like better? They all maintain young earth creation. It's not like they refute it. And so anyway, Sam, go ahead, brother. You're going to say something.
Yeah. I guess two things. The first is a question. Has anyone tried to make a correlation between the tree of life and Christ being like the water of life and the bread of life? Eat from the bread of life, drink from the water of life, eat from the tree of life. Has anyone ever historically argued that? Anything like that?
Probably, but I don't know. I'm not aware of it. Okay.
And then I think the other, so my personal view on just I don't know about the tree. That's an interesting thing that I might look into. But I don't think Adam was in the garden for more than a day. So I don't think that there would have been a problem with death. I mean, I think that in the same way that, when I'm in my flesh or I separate myself from Christ, I'm going to sin right away. And it seems like it reads that he came back in the garden in the cool of the evening. So created Adam, they named the animals, went and had lunch. Christ came back to find Adam had sinned, and it was a day. That's my personal view. I think that kind of avoids that problem, but I don't know that. Yeah.
I guess you would disagree with the usage of this then, Ben, which is fine, because as you're probably familiar with, the usual or a common young earth creationist counter to this argument that says, well, the Bible just describes no death for man before the fall. It says nothing about animals. And we will typically point to Romans 8:20-23. I'm sure this is not new to the majority of informed people on this. because it also does say the creation, right? For the creature was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who hath subjected the same in hope, because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. And so one could say that not only does the no death before the fall apply to humans, but also the whole creation, as in the animal creation. You know, I'm sure you've heard that, Ben. So I'm curious, what are your overall thoughts then on that bit of pushback from us, from young Earth creationists?
As though I'm not. No.
No, you are, but as in, like, you know.
I know. No, I think the strongest argument from that verse is where the word for pain there is a word that's used for pain in childbirth.
Mm-hmm.
And so they'll argue that is, and sometimes it's even translated that way, that they'll argue that this is Paul intentionally referencing the pain in childbirth that was part of the curse on the woman in Genesis 3. And so they're saying that this point in Genesis 3 is when Paul is saying that this corruption was instituted in the world. So the typical young Earth view is that all of this corruption that we're seeing in Romans 8 here was not there before the fall,
right?
And then was instituted at the moment of the fall, when God gives the 3 curses to the snake and the man and the woman. Okay. I don't think that is the case. I've never heard it put quite the way you put it, because usually young Earthers are kind of forced to admit that there was certain kinds of death prior to the fall, right, such as bacterial death, such as plant death, and plant death certainly had to be part of God's plan for creation from the beginning, because otherwise, what would the animals eat? Eventually, if you've got a cow chomping on grass, eventually they're going to uproot the grass and eat the roots, and it's going to die.
Yeah, right.
Okay? So the usual argument that is made is that death before the fall only applied to non-animal life. And by animal, they mean like what the ancient Hebrews would have meant by an animal, not what modern scientists mean by that.
Like nefesh.
Yeah, like so, it would be the plant life, insects. They wouldn't have the nefesh.
Right. And
yeah,
the Hebrew word nefesh actually comes from the word for neck. And it's a reference to the lifeblood of an animal. The breath of an animal goes through your neck. Okay. And so things that had a neck, right, might be in the category of nefesh. Okay. So the issue that I have here is actually, I'm agreeing with you that Romans 8 is talking about the whole creation. It is not sectioning out only nefesh. And nefesh is a Hebrew word anyway. Paul wasn't using Hebrew here. Right. So my argument is basically that this kind of distinction that is being made depends on a Hebrew word that is in Genesis, I think, and sort of transporting the meaning of that Hebrew word into this passage in Romans 8, and I don't see it. So, and I agree that distinction is not made in Romans 8, but that's an argument for my position, not yours.
No, that's fair. I wanted to see where you're coming from on that. Praise, I think you unmuted. Go ahead, brother. Oh, Praise, were you going to make a point or an argument?
Oh, no. I didn't unmute though either. I don't know.
Sam, it might have been you. Go ahead. Feel free.
Yeah, well, I mean, but even so, like the whole creation is still suffering the result, because everything is tending towards a disorder and decay, and plants are now being eaten, and rocks are dissolving, and the earth is just under the curse of the fall. So,
Oh yeah, for sure.
yeah.
I
So
think
we could
Paul,
still not just limit it to Nefesh in the garden, but because of the result of what Adam and Eve had done, then all creation now suffers the consequences. Even the rocks outside are falling away.
right, and that's why I appeal to backwards causation. Because I think that was God's plan from the beginning, is he knew we were going to sin because he knows the future. And so in the initial creation, he instituted consequences of the fall. And the interesting thing is there's examples in creation science where creation scientists have suggested things very similar to this without realizing what they're doing. So, for example, John Baumgartner, when he formulated the catastrophic plate tectonics theory, he surmised that maybe God, when he created the Earth, which would be in the first 6 days, he made these giant cold fault lines along the crust of the Earth, and then he made it so that the timing would work out, that when the cold crust finally broke the crust, and then the crust subducted into the mantle, that caused the flood to start. Well, the flood has certainly got to be understood as a consequence of sin, that God never would have caused that to happen. But Baumgartner suggested that maybe God made the earth with this in mind already, that the earth was designed so that it could undergo a catastrophe like this from the beginning, and that would be temporally before the fall, meaning in the timeline, that would be before the fall. But in a logical sense, it would be a consequence of the fall. And so there you have a situation there where there's certain things that on creation science models you would expect that God had to put this in from the beginning as a consequence of sin.
Yeah, you could say, you could make a distinction between a logical order and a chronological order. So
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And this is where I get into debates with open theists. This is a whole nother subject, but it comes in. It's talked about more often in discussions of God's sovereignty, where open theists will say, no, a temporal sequence has to be the same as a logical sequence.
No,
and this is why they deny that God can have foreknowledge.
Yeah, it's definitely a head bender for sure. And I think I would acknowledge, I probably would disagree with that position of death before the fall, but I would fully agree that you can have because William Lane Craig, although his theology is bad, some of his philosophical arguments are fantastic. And when defending free will, he'll make a distinction between God knowing something or something that happens necessarily, I guess, arguing against causal determinism by acknowledging the distinction between a logical order and a chronological order. If the logical order were to be different, if I were to choose to do this instead of that, then chronologically God would have done or known things to be a different way too. So I think it follows. I think that the distinction, I mean, of course it's got to be, but anyway, I guess that's a really long conversation.
That is a great conversation. And that is a conversation we could probably have for 4 to 5 hours. So great stuff. I love this interaction. It does bring one thing to mind based on the challenge issued at us young earth creationists about carnivory and adaptation after the fall, because a lot of critics will say, oh, well, you're going to have these massive mechanical changes, physiological changes to non-carnivorous animals after the fall. How come a lot of these creatures look like they're designed to kill, like the teeth of a T-Rex or a great white shark or so on and so forth? But one could say, and I've argued before, that God put these genetic switches, a lot of these genetic switches in the original created kinds, knowing that after the fall, they would have to adapt to these post-fall environments and the survival of a lot of creatures. And so a lot of what we're seeing in the fossil record being the result of the flood, so a couple thousand years after the after the creation may not be an exact reflection of what would have existed at creation in the garden and outside of the garden. Like the T-Rex, clearly designed in many ways to kill and for carnivory, but a lot of this could have been due to pre-programmed genetic switches that were basically turned on after the fall. So anyways, let's continue here. I think there are some good points and interaction there in that section, and let's see what Redeem Zoomer has for us next. Praise, would you do us the honors of clicking the play button?
Absolutely. Hold on here.
In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were not allowed to eat from the tree of knowledge, but they were allowed to eat from the tree of life, which grants immortality. What's the purpose of a tree that grants immortality if death isn't even a thing yet? That directly implies that death was already a thing in the world. We know that evil was already a thing because Satan was already in the garden tempting them. So the fall of Satan and the angels must have been before the fall of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve rejected eternal life with God just so they could sin. So the fall of humanity was not the introduction of evil into the world. It was humanity siding with evil over eternal life with God. That deserves hell, if anything does. John Calvin and many other theologians say that the substance of the tree of life is the same as the substance of the Eucharist, which is union with Christ. Hypothetically, if Adam had eaten of the tree of life and rejected Satan, he would have immediately had perfect union with Christ, been perfectly sanctified, become immortal, become God's kingly representative on earth, and become a great warrior who defeated all evil and inaugurated God's kingdom in all the universe. It's pretty clear from Scripture that the Garden of Eden was very good but not perfect, and work still needed to be done, which Adam should have done but failed to do. Because Genesis 1:4 says God saw the light was good and separated it from the darkness, which implies the darkness is not exactly good. Maybe not evil, but at least imperfect, because evil is just a deprivation of good. It's generally understood that in the new heavens and the new earth, everything is going to be perfect in a way that the Garden of Eden was not. You might ask, why would God allow this?
Okay,
Why
pause
would
it
God
there,
allow
Praise.
imperfections in his...
Gentlemen, what are your thoughts on that section?
I mean, there's some things I disagree with there. He's using a privation argument. I don't like that argument. I'm not sure how relevant a lot of this stuff is, but I think that, did he attribute this to John Calvin, that
Yes.
that Adam only ever faced one choice, and if he had made the right one, he would have been perfect forever or something?
Yeah.
Wow, that seems very strange to me. I would assume that you would have to maintain forever a sinless state.
Yeah.
In order to remain in perfect communion with God. So you would have to continually choose not to sin.
Right.
Not just that there's
it wouldn't
one,
just be a one, right.
Yeah. And then there's one thing he said there that I think is just blatantly contradictory to Romans 5, but I can't remember his exact wording now, but you need to make, he said something about, because Romans 5:12 says pretty flatly that sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin. You can't say that sin entered the world through Lucifer, because that just blatantly contradicts what Paul says in Romans 5. But I don't know why he needs to say that if he's using the sort of outside of time argument. It's just another kind of an example of what I've seen with him. He's a young guy and his heart is in the right place, but his mind isn't always. And he has a massive platform, and that gives him a big responsibility. According to James 3:1, right? We have, as teachers, we have a greater responsibility. So he needs to be very careful about what he says there. And I think he said something that said sin was already in the world, I think is what he said, because of Satan. That's not what the Bible says. That's contradictory to what the Bible says. Okay. Now, Satan was in the world, and Satan had sinned, but Satan was not in a position to cause the consequences of sin to enter the world. God was, I think, probably restricting him from doing that. Okay. All that God was doing was allowing Adam and Eve the choice, a free choice. And that,
Right.
that gets into a whole nother can of worms of why he would do that. Right. But, I do disagree with the privation argument about that good is just the absence of evil. But we don't need to get into that. It's not really relevant.
Sam, any thoughts, brother?
So I do have some points, but did I miss? I think he hasn't made the conclusion yet where he talks about how death brings life and therefore evolution is most consistent. I think he's about ready to drop that.
I think that might be the last couple of minutes.
So yeah, I've got some points on that here, but
okay. Well, let's continue then. Let's praise, unless there's something you wanted to contribute there. Go ahead. If not,
I would just say sin is actually what the law says is transgression against the law. And so I think he's imposing his own definition of it. And that's why we need grace. So I would just say that.
Okay. Appreciate it, praise.
Creation.
Good stuff.
From
Continue.
the beginning. And why would God create using a process of evolution that requires so much death? Now, this connects to the broader problem of evil, which we will address in a future video. But generally, the Reformed interpretation is that God allows evil so that he can be glorified in defeating it through Christ. That's the whole theme of the Bible. God brings good out of evil. God brings light out of the darkness. And evolution is consistent with this theme. In evolution, life comes from death, because death drives natural selection, which produces more beautiful and complex and advanced life.
Pause a quick phrase. I just wanted to make one quick point in general on the video itself, the material of it, including this part. It's a lot of assertion. So he's assuming in these arguments that evolution is true, that evolution is backed by science, that common descent is the best explanation for the origin of life. And now he's going to these scriptures and saying, and because we know evolution's true, and God can make things good out of things that are evil, like his point there on light and darkness, and death, obviously, in terms of evolutionary advancement, you require death of the less fit organisms. But he's saying, but you get good out of that, because eventually you'll get humans, I guess, and eventually Christ, who conquers death. But all of this is just assuming that common descent is even true in the first place, that is the true explanation for the history of biological life on this planet. So it's a lot of stretching, I think. But I just wanted to make that point. Feel free to interact with that gentleman or continue the video.
Yeah, I think even if we were to agree with the point that he's trying to make, or the nature of the point that he's trying to make, because we do live in a world where there is death and fall and pain, this would be what you, Donnie, regularly call an agnostic line of evidence.
Right.
It doesn't have to be because of evolution. It could just be because of the fall. And that's what the Bible says it is.
Well, we know the Bible says that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. So many bad and evil things happen to us in this fallen world, but that doesn't mean good can't come out of that. Just like with the story of Joseph and what his brothers had done unto him, there was good that came out of that. So God can take the evil that is done unto man, and if we follow God and we follow his ways, then we too could have those things work together for good. But to take it to the extent that he is, I think, is an extrapolation fallacy. It assumes a lot of things for sure.
Well, yeah. So this is, this is pretty much where he says, if he didn't just say it, that that death brings life in the Bible because the death of Christ brought life, and therefore evolution best comports with the gospel because it's the system of death that brings life. And I believe I've accurately represented his argument here. But I think that it's problematic because he's equivocating on the word death. And it's because it's the death of our spiritual flesh that brings that sanctification and ultimately perfection. And it's not the death of our physical flesh. So the question I would ask him is, what about the physical death of the unbeliever? Is that a good thing? And it's also a sin that leads to death. And by death, we mean eternal separation. And that's why we need a savior. And ultimately, it's that sin that he's talking about that caused Christ to die. And so from our current predicament, meaning that we've all fallen through Adam and we need a savior from the creaturely perspective, yeah, it's a good thing that Christ came and died and made a way from us. But from the creator's perspective, I mean, wouldn't it have been better if humanity didn't sin? Then Christ wouldn't have to die. I think maybe I'm missing something within his particular theology there, but that just doesn't sound right to me. What do you guys think?
I agree with that. I think we would have been way better off if nobody had ever sinned. Everything would be perfect.
Yeah, and I think it's safe to say that as soon as Adam and Eve fell, because I wouldn't argue that Adam and Eve were created glorified or regenerated. They were in a state different than that. We as believers, as soon as we believe and trust Christ through faith, we're predestined for glorification. We will get a new body. That's a guarantee. We'll be like him. And we'll see that in, the new heaven and new earth. So when Adam and Eve sinned and fell, I think it's safe to say that when they recognized that, they got saved soon after that. Especially when the prophecy is given about the seed of the woman that would come and bruise the head of Satan. And so I guess the point is, a lot of what he said here in the last 4 or 5 minutes, I don't think there's all that much really supporting his overall position or even critique of young earth creation. A lot of it is agnostic. Some of it we would agree with, as Ben said. Some of it is interesting that we can interact with. There's a lot of unknowns in terms of the tree of life and all the details there. But anyways, if anyone else wanted to add some more points, feel free to do so, or we could probably start to wrap up his video here. Sounds like we're coming close to the end. Praise, go ahead.
Was the death of Christ, but that brought about the best event ever, which is the resurrection of Christ. So evolution is the creation model that is most consistent with the gospel and the overarching narrative of Scripture. And in general, whenever God creates things in Scripture, it's always by an organic evolutionary process. For example, God didn't just snap his fingers and create the entire church at once. Jesus said the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, which starts small and grows into a big tree with many branches. When God created Israel, he started with Abraham and branched out into many different tribes. When God created all of humanity, he started with Adam, and Adam had many descendants.
What he's saying here fits better with the true biblical creation model that says God creates original kinds. He creates Adam and Eve, front loads them with heterozygosity, lots of DNA diversity. And from there, so for example, you see his images here, right? Well, I've got the same images in my separate ancestry presentation. You could have Adam and Eve, or you can have the original created kinds. And then from there, you get branches because they're changing. So you have an original created thing. Let's say the original created Felid type or Canid type. And then from there, you get a lot of change. You get adaptation, recombination leads to new chromosomal combinations. You get novel phenotypes because it's built in, so on and so forth. So yeah, that's the type of evolution we believe in. But the type of evolution, Ben, that he's trying to say best accounts or is most consistent with the gospel, he means large scale evolution, death, degeneration, extinction, the wiping out of less fit creatures and the continuation of more fit creatures and so on and so forth. I'm not seeing that here with these visuals. It would fit far better with our created kind model, where from the original created archetype, you get variations.
Yeah. Hey, is eugenics most consistent with the gospel? I mean, that's the argument.
Yeah.
Anything which starts small and gets big later, that must be true because it's in the Bible or something. I don't.
Yeah.
This is a really terrible argument.
It is. And
I don't know why.
It's you said it perfectly. It's a terrible argument. I mean, look at his example there with Israel, Abraham. So from one man, and then you get different tribes. Okay, from Adam and Eve, and you get different people groups. From the original Felid or Canid kind, you get variations of those groups. This has nothing to do with common descent. It has nothing to do with this process of large-scale evolution. Anyways, Praise, feel free to continue.
That branched into many different nations. So it's perfectly consistent to think that God made all of life this way, starting with one common ancestor,
no,
branching out into all the different species.
This is so bad. I want to see Redeem Zoomer engage in a scientific exchange, a high-level scientific exchange. He needs to demonstrate his assertions. He didn't prove anything here. Evolution does not contradict the Bible. He's assuming that, well, firstly, by evolution, he means common descent. He's assuming that does not contradict science, but show us how all life goes back to a common ancestor. What this shows is original created archetypes, and from those archetypes, you get variations. But not that every single form of life, including banana plants, celery, humans, and chimps, go back to a single-celled like ancestor. You see how he sneaks that in there with number 4? Praise?
Yeah, I don't think he knows much about science, and because of that, I think he needs to be very careful about presenting himself as someone who does know and can vouch for these types of conclusions as though he's some kind of expert. That's kind of the way he talks, but hopefully that will come with maturity and more intellectual humility. So.
Good points, Ben. Okay. Praise, continue.
Evangelicals are always wondering why the Bible has all these seemingly unimportant family trees. Maybe take a hint and realize that's how God creates things. Speaking of genealogies, some people point out that if you add up the ages of the patriarchs in Genesis, then Adam lived 6,000 years ago. And this is technically true if you take a very literalistic reading of Genesis. But this video from Inspiring Philosophy shows that the ages of the patriarchs are most likely symbolic numbers rather than their actual historical ages. Many reasons for this, but the biggest one is that they're not randomly distributed. All the ages of the patriarchs are some ideal number with some symbolic significance. And ancient Hebrew culture was very into the symbolic meaning of numbers, and often adjusted genealogies so that they would fit some important number. That raises the question, are we supposed to take Genesis literally? It's not a strict yes or no, because many of the early church fathers, especially of the Alexandrian...
Okay. Can you go back and show the numbers?
Yeah. Let's address those symbolic numbers, but I do want to address this real quick. Okay. Firstly, I love how he puts the word very in there. Very literally. Well, we interpret the Bible literarily, so we understand the nature of writings, and we know that there are events of symbolism and imagery and allegory and so on and so forth. Okay. But right here, he keeps interpreting something like this to mean common descent, that all life goes right back to a single-celled-like ancestor billions of years ago. Now, God creates an original pair of humans, And from there, you get variations. Yeah, that's the way God creates. He said, God said, be fruitful and multiply, not be fruitful and clone yourselves. So he creates Adam and Eve with pre-existing diversity. And from them, you get all the different people groups. From other created kinds, you get variations. That doesn't mean every single created archetype goes back to a single-celled like ancestor. It's an extrapolation fallacy. He says very literally. Okay, let's just go through a couple of these passages quickly. Very literally, he says, okay, Genesis 2:7, and the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground. Pretty simple. Genesis 2, verse 22, and the rib which the Lord God had taken from man made he a woman. Okay, so Adam from the dust, Eve from Adam. I don't see any common ancestry with chimpanzees. I don't see any common ancestry with banana plants. What does Jesus say? And he answered and said unto them, have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning, referring back to the creation week, day 6, made them male and female? Speaking of Adam and Eve. He says it again in Mark 10:6. Adam's called the first man. Pretty simple. And Genesis 3:20 calls Eve the mother of all living. So he has to scoff at this. He has to make this sound unlike something it clearly sounds like, which is pretty easy to figure out, that Adam and Eve were created first, separate and special from any other form of life, including celery, that we apparently share 50% of DNA with, according to him. Okay. And he has to say, oh, this would be taking it very literally. No, we're reading it literarily, and we understand that which is meant to be historical. Okay. And so anyways, I just wanted to point that out just to show how clear the scriptures are on the issue that Adam's the first man, Eve, the mother of all living, created special and separate from any other form of life. And it just so turns out, gentlemen, that the scientific data strongly supports that. And we've discussed that in detail here. And so, okay, Ben Kissling, what are your thoughts, brother, on this reference to Inspiring Philosophy's video on what the true ages mean?
This view is covered in William Lane Craig's book, and Craig rips it to shreds, and rightly so, because it is crazy. First of all, you notice there that in Jared, Methuselah, Lamech, you have to subtract 7 on all of those. Why do you have to subtract 7 and not on any of the other numbers? And you notice that the only thing they're getting out of that is that makes it divisible by 5. Why is that meaningful? Nobody knows. No one can explain that. And in the Redeemed Zoomer's other video, he mentions 2 numbers that he thinks are symbolic. He doesn't do that here, okay? And those numbers are 777. That's the age of Lamech when he died. And the other one is 365. Because, well, don't you know, that's the number of days in a year. But not on the Hebrew calendar. The Hebrew calendar didn't have 365 days on it. So that's an anachronistic argument. And 777, okay, maybe a point there. But why are you now subtracting 7 from it in the diagram? I thought 777 was explained because it's 3 7s, so therefore it's symbolic on its own. I've heard people claim that this is in hexadecimal, like base 60. And then they go on and claim, well, 365 is meaningful because it's number of days in a year. Well, yeah, but in base 10, so they changed the base of it and then use the base 10 number. I mean, this is a crazy argument. And the big glaring issue is, what do they all mean? No one ever says that. No one ever says this is what they all mean, because no one has any idea. So how can you make the claim that they're all symbolic if you have no freaking clue what they symbolize? There's no evidence for this view at all. None. There's no symbolic meaning to these numbers. Now, the further claim is that, well, and Redeem Zoomer is not the only one who has made this claim. For example, Wes Huff, when he went on Joe Rogan's show several months back, he made this argument too, is that the numbers in the genealogies are not randomly distributed. Well, there's a couple of things that go into that sort of thing. One is that there's a very clear pattern that they live to be around 900 years. So why would we expect them to be randomly distributed if there's going to be a bunch of nines in it? Because there's just a physical thing there that is limiting human lifespan to around that amount. There's a certain aspect where we wouldn't expect them to be randomly distributed from our point of view. The other issue is like, how are you calculating that? I would like to see the calculation. I fully expect it not to be randomly distributed, but what would be important to look at is whether or not it depends a lot on the number of nines that are there and the number of ones, because that's when most of them had kids, when they were in their hundreds. Okay, so I don't think just the raw claim that they're not randomly distributed proves very much. That fits with our interpretation as well, pretty easily. So I need to see someone give me a rundown of all of these numbers and what every single one symbolizes before I take this view seriously. And there are plenty of people who are old Earth who don't take this view seriously because it's freaking crazy. It's Bible code nonsense. It's like running into the Bible and finding all these numbers and then saying it means that, well, this predicts that Obama would be president or something. You know, I mean, this is crazy.
And even if there is, this is just a thought that came to mind, so if I'm wrong, correct me. But even if there's some symbolism in things that are literal, like, hey, some people have a name, that's their literal name, it's real, but there's a meaning behind it. There's some symbolism behind it. So even if there was a level of symbolism to the ages or even the patriarchs' names, that still wouldn't prove that the ages aren't literal, that they live to a certain age. I mean, sure, maybe the age is symbolic of something, but like you said, Ben, right? You're asking, well, what is it's symbolic? I'm sure they can make up something. But another point too, we don't have to twist it like this. We can take it literal. We can take it for what it says. It lines up beautiful with science. We've discussed many times, right, Ben? I think we even discussed it on our last program together. We've had no counter to the science that we've discussed in our 3 Refuting the Critics programs together. But the way that the ages are laid out, pre-flood and post-flood, lines up perfectly with what? A biological decay curve, which lines up with what we know about mutation accumulation and genetic degeneration. And so for this all to be symbolic and for it to not be literal, I guess you could say, then the Bible authors would have had to have advanced knowledge in mathematics and biological decay curves for it to just so coincidentally line up with what we know about science and mutation accumulation. So point is again, it lines up so beautifully with science. Understanding the Bible when it says that God created 2 people, Adam and Eve, special and unique and separate from any other form of life. Guess what? That lines up with what we know about science. We have many lines of evidence that are discriminatory and non-agnostic. And so we don't need to go in and do all this twisting and over allegorizing like the theistic evolutionists do. Sam, go ahead.
Yeah.
Whoever wants to go.
I'm just going to rant again. So
rant away, brother. That's what we do. I got to say, there is a lot to rant about, isn't there, on this video?
Yeah.
How does he know which numbers we're supposed to subtract 7 from? Because the result is they're divisible by 5. Well, how do you know the ancient Hebrew authors meant us to divide them by 5?
Just trust him, bro.
Just trust me, bro. Well, that's what a lot of it's confirmation bias for their audience that are really anti-young Earth creation. We started the show, I made a couple points that being a young Earth creationist, if you want to defend the Bible, defend the science, it does require a lot of study and to be well-rounded, jack of all trades in many ways, because there's challenges from every field. But I feel a lot of your theistic evolutionists, they don't really want to put in that work and study to debunk things like radiometric dating, distant starlight, ERVs, pseudogenes, nested hierarchies, whatever, you name it. So they'd rather just give in, basically, and compromise the Bible. No, go focus on other forms of apologetics, right? Like someone like Wes Huff with what he does, right? Let him focus on what he does. Don't go compromise the Bible. If somebody brings up an argument for evolution, just refer them to, I don't know, Nathaniel Jeanson, Rob Carter, AIG, us, whoever. You don't have to compromise the Bible, because to them, they might feel like it's easier. Well, just believe in the billions of years, believe in common descent, and then we don't really have to get into all that with the atheist. But I think that's the wrong way to approach things. Sam, go ahead, brother. You're going to say something?
Yeah, real quick. So 2 Timothy chapter 3:16 says that all scripture is inspired by God and useful to teach us what is true and to make us realize what is wrong in our lives. And it corrects us when we are wrong and teaches us to do what is right. That's the New Living Translation. So I can look at those genealogies and I can defend biblical creation. I can show the biological decay curve with those things. I can use that scripture to teach and defend the doctrine of Genesis again. But Redeem Zoomer, he punts to mystery. Is that what have we learned there?
Yeah, I don't know how anybody who's Ben, do you think any informed young Earth creationist is going to watch Redeem Zoomer's video and be convinced and think to themselves, you know what, this is a good case for common descent being in the Bible or being consistent with the Bible? It certainly doesn't do anything to overturn the science of young Earth creation. But in your opinion, could any informed, talk about informed young Earth creationists, be even somewhat convinced by his I know I wasn't, even remotely challenged by it. But yeah, Ben, what are your thoughts, brother?
I mean, I agree. I'm not sure. It seems like his purpose here is to defend his own position from arguments that have been made against it, or that he thinks have been made against it, or that he made up against it. So to be a little fair to him, I think his purpose is not to prove young Earth creationism wrong. It's to demonstrate the viability of his own view. So obviously, I don't think any of us would be persuaded, but I'm not sure that's what he's trying to do.
You know what, Ben, I think you make a good point. I think he's doing something similar to what Inspiring Philosophy does in his debates. Is evolution compatible with the Bible? Basically saying, hey, don't attack me for believing in evolution and interpreting the Bible my own way, because look, it works. It's consistent. He's basically, I think, giving people a reason to be a theistic evolutionist, not be a young Earth creationist. And so rather than counter young Earth creation, providing an alternative and hopefully convince young Earth creationists to look at that alternative and say, okay, it's a plausible alternative. Kind of like we've done on many points, right? We'll say, okay, yeah, that I might not fully agree with that point, but I can see why you believe that. It's within orthodoxy. It works. I think that's kind of what they're looking for, but I would say no, it's not even a good hypothesis.
I mean, I would definitely agree. He has a lot more work to do to defend his own view anyway. So I've watched some of his videos, and he's way more knowledgeable on the theology and stuff like that, especially the history of theology, the history of the church. He's very well informed on that stuff. This issue, he's not very well informed on, I don't think. And so he's really just kind of putting his thumb in the gap and trying to stop the leak there. And
well, it's why we started the show off by saying, hey, just because we're critiquing him on theistic evolution doesn't mean he's wrong on everything. He's right on a lot of things. From what I've seen, he believes the gospel, which would make him a brother in Christ. It's not like you have to be a young earth creationist to be saved. It is an authority issue. I wouldn't argue that it's a salvation issue. But if you're going to fully believe the Bible and believe everything it says, then yeah, you're going to be a young earth creationist. You know, the non-young earth creationists probably won't be at the head of the table in the millennium, but they'll be there. But I wanted to point out this comment. Andrew Cumming. There is no scientific support for young earth. What an assertion. And after correcting Andrew so many times, Ben, praise, Sam, there's no scientific evidence for young earth creation. The helium and zircon crystals, the C14 in diamonds and coal, the arguments that we put forth from molecular clocks, none of it is good evidence for young earth creation, apparently. Ben, if someone were skeptical, as we start to wind things down, if someone were skeptical, you're in an elevator, but they're actually open-minded. Here's the thing, okay? A good question to ask, I think, skeptics is, if Christianity were true, would you be a Christian? You'd be surprised, or maybe you're not surprised, but there are many atheists out there that would and have said no. Well, that means no amount of evidence is going to convince them. People like Aaron Ra, Matt Dillahunty, T-Jump, these militant atheists, they've said that even if Jesus or God himself came down, presented himself to them, they still wouldn't believe, because they don't like the God of the Bible. They don't like the morals. They don't like what God has to say. Anyways, so I'm talking about an objective thinker, someone who's willing to look at the evidence. If they were to say in an elevator, Ben, and you only had 30 seconds to a minute, they were to say, there's no scientific evidence for young earth creation, but I'm willing to listen. They were willing to listen. What piece of evidence, one or two, would you look to? Which do you feel are just really powerful and persuasive?
If I only had 30 seconds, wow.
Let's give you a couple minutes. It's a longer elevator trip.
If I only had that amount of time, I would probably use the argument about salt concentration in the oceans, because that's really easy to explain. The rate at which salt accumulates in the oceans because of runoff from the continents, salt dissolves into rivers and runs off into the oceans. And so salt but when water evaporates from the surface of the ocean, the salt doesn't evaporate. So it leaves the salt in the ocean and the water cycle continues. So that means salt is continuing to accumulate in the oceans. And there's a rate at which that occurs, and we've measured it. And if the oceans are billions of years old, the oceans should be way past the saturation point. There should be as much salt in the oceans as there can be, and there's not. And so that is evidence, very good evidence, that the oceans are young. Another one, if I had time, would be the cold spots they found in the mantle, the Earth's mantle near the core. These are measurements that are made where they infer a temperature based on the motion of the material down there. And they found these cold spots that are something like, I think, 500 to 1,000 degrees Celsius colder than the surrounding mantle. And they're way down there. They're near the core. And as you know, things, if they're surrounded by a really hot thing, they will heat up. The heat will equilibrate over time. That's how your stove works. the stove top heats up and the heat is transferred to the pot or whatever you're cooking. Okay. And so over time, the heat would equilibrate into those areas. And what the cold areas show is that there's not been enough time for that heat to equilibrate there. So there are these cold spots down in the mantle that have to be young. And the creationist model of the flood, the catastrophic plate tectonics model, gives a mechanism, if I'm running out of time here, gives the mechanism for why there would be those cold spots down there. And recently.
Yeah, those are great. So your first one, basically, we know the rate as to which salt accumulates in the oceans, meaning if the oceans were as old as old Earth proponents would say, then the oceans should be oversaturated at this point, basically, is what you said. Yeah.
Yeah. In chemistry, there's a thing called a saturation point, where it's the maximum amount of a solute that can be dissolved in a solution. And the oceans aren't there yet.
What if a critic were to say, well, that rate is not constant?
Well, then why are you angry at us for saying that the rate of nuclear decay is not constant?
Because double standard.
Right. But the point is that if you want any kind of extrapolation from current data into the past, you have to make assumptions. Okay. And so if your assumptions are incorrect, then your conclusion's incorrect, obviously. But that's a problem that everybody has to deal with. It's not just us. And yet people still make these arguments. So it's an argument. It's not meant to be a logical proof. There aren't any proofs in science.
Right. We're supposed to disprove things. And so, okay, that's a good point. Your second one, yeah, that's one of my favorites as well. These massive slabs of cool rock that we find deep within the earth that must have been subducted there just thousands of years ago, or else, as you said, they would have either assimilated to the surrounding rock or even melted if they were taken down there millions of years ago through snail paste movement. It would be like my coffee. It's cold now. It's been sitting here for 3 hours, right? We've been doing a marathon here. And so it's cold. But if it was still hot and steam was coming out, it probably, we probably haven't been doing this for 3 hours unless my wife brought me down a fresh cup of coffee, or if you put an ice cube into a hot coffee. And I said, that coffee's been sitting there, and it started off hot. It's been sitting there for 5 hours, but the ice cube was, not melted. Well, it probably hasn't been there for that long. So I think that's a great point, Ben.
A little story about that. I mentioned this to one of my professors at Biola, who's has a science background. And I know that he was thinking about it because he came back on the class message board and said, well, I looked into this, and this is actually they think it might be actually due to the motion of what's going on down there, not the temperature. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have time to respond to that, but I'm like, I know that he was looking at stuff that made him think a little bit, so that's good. But the point is that he had it a little bit backwards. Is we infer the temperature from the measurements that indicate the motion. Okay, so the temperature is an inference, but it's a solid inference that's made in the secular literature. So wouldn't motion make it warmer? Well, so things have motion if they have a temperature. Okay, so they're comparing it to the motion in the surrounding mantle. Okay.
And to people listening who might be new to this, these cold slabs that we find, that is, I think, really good evidence for rapid plate movement during the flood, because a lot of critics will say, oh, that's post hoc ad hoc, the meters per second movements of the plates during the flood year to get the continents to where they are today. But hey,
ergo prompter hoc.
Yeah. But at the same time, we find these cold slabs, which we say that must have been due to rapid runaway subduction, which one could say is a confirmed prediction of the model. or else, yeah, they should have been melted or at least assimilated to the surrounding material. So those are two really good points, Ben. I think you would have converted or at least got that skeptic to think in the elevator, brother. Sam, where would you point them?
So I'm a diehard transcendental argument guy. So if we're going to talk about science, I would point out, like I have with Andrew, that science has preconditions, and the naturalist, the atheist, their worldview cannot satisfy those preconditions. And then I would make a positive argument that it is the Christian worldview alone that satisfies those preconditions for science intelligibility, and therefore Christianity is objectively proven. And the critic, like Andrew, is living in God's world, but pretending that there is no God. And I've made these arguments with him, with Erica, with many others. They can't address it. There have been atheist philosophers that have made these arguments. That's the argument I mention regularly that brought Anthony Flew to deism, one of them anyway. So there's powerful arguments. But that would be the argument that I would make. But I do agree with Ben, and that's a fantastic argument. There's also hot blobs, so it's not just cold slabs. It's hot blobs, and that just compounds the problem. Because I didn't have hot coffee, I had cold water with ice cubes in it, and they are melted now.
Yeah.
How do you explain that? And of course, they've got their little just so stories. They're gonna pretend that they got it all figured out, like your professor, Ben. But okay.
Yeah, because the hot blobs are displaced by the cold blobs, right? So the hot blobs get pushed up in the mantle as the cold blobs go down. Another quick point to make on that is that we touched on it sort of, but to be clear, if the rate of plate subduction that we observe now resulted in those cold spots being down there, the rate that we observe now is so slow that even way before those slabs would have gotten to that distance down in the mantle, they would have melted already and essentially become part of the mantle. So the rate of subduction is an issue there as well, because I think you did mention that, Donnie, but just to be clear, is like, as it's going down, if it's going down that slowly, it's equilibrating in temperature as it moves. So it's also evidence that it had to be really rapid subduction.
Yeah, like slow, ever so slowly putting a candle into molten wax. If you do it really slow, it's going to melt.
Which means this is another challenge I want to issue to theistic evolutionists like Redeem Zoomer. Let's see you respond in detail to just a couple points here. We've done entire shows where we go over in detail the amazing science of young earth creation. And let's see one of these theistic evolutionists actually put in the work, put out a video responding, and we promise you we'll respond to the response. Because, see, here's the thing. Everybody's going to have rescue devices. Where we're dealing with worldviews here, and both sides might have to have rescue devices now and again. But the question is it a good rescue device? Is it a convincing rescue device? And so many times the evolutionist puts forth rescue devices that are nothing but fanciful storytelling, like the way they attempt to explain the Y chromosome dissimilarity argument, or the way that they try and explain the C14 in diamonds through contamination and other means. They don't even really have a good one for the helium and zircon crystals. The cold slabs is another one. And so to what you said, Sam, great points. I'd recommend, so Jason Lau, he just put out a really good presentation on that on the Answers in Genesis YouTube channel. I listened to the whole thing, really good. But he also goes into some of the objections that could be made to what you're saying, Sam, and then he refutes those. And it got me thinking as well. So that's really good. Okay. Andrew Cummings says, the helium in zircons is easy to explain. So easy, he asserted it. You just ignore the answer. Dr. Russell Humphreys, he did a written exchange 4 or 5 of them, with a scientist from Reasons to Believe who attempted to refute Russell Humphrey's work on that. And Russell Humphreys did an excellent job responding to all those criticisms. So I would be surprised, gentlemen, if there's a criticism or so-called objection that have been put forth by the critics that Russell Humphreys hasn't already debunked.
They've even published one in one of the Young Earth journals. They published a criticism of Humphreys' work, and then Humphreys responded in the journal.
Well, I didn't know that. Okay. Even more then. That's great.
I can't remember the guy's name, but I think his argument was something along the lines of, it was a very technical argument around I think the size of the grains that they measured or something. And Humphrey's response was basically, okay, even assume, he basically argued, no, this is the way you do this. It's a standard methodology. But then he basically said, even if you take all the assumptions that you gave in your criticism and assume they're all correct, that still gives about maximum 1 million years for this.
Wow.
Which is not close to enough for the old Earth view.
It's incredible.
When you had Dr. Aaron Shoulders on, molecular biologist, talking about the biological decay rates within the dinosaur soft tissue, the critics will suggest that these things have been refuted. Like Andrew will say, oh, we've dealt with those. But they're dealing with them are just assertions that can't be defended. And that's what Dr. Shoulders pointed out. There have been assertions about what might preserve this soft tissue that we find in dinosaur bones, but nothing that can be actually defended. So let's make that clear, that there's a distinction between an assertion that something's been refuted and whether or not something has actually been
right. Let's see these critics publish in the Answers Research Journal. They do it, as Ben said. Dr. Stephan Frello published several responses. He's an evolutionist. He's not even a theist, as far as I know. And they published his critiques of Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson and his replacing Darwin model. And Dr. Jeanson responded, and I think he responded adequately. You can leave that up to the reader to read all the exchanges and come to their own conclusion. And so the critics need to put in the work, and they can publish rather than making assertions. And I've done whole presentations on this, so I'm not going to give another one here, but I just wanted to refer people here. So here's the paper I'd highly recommend reading. We can see if Redeem Zoomer can refute it. Helium diffusion rates support accelerated nuclear decay. So we know the rates of helium diffusion, and these zircon crystals are supposedly billions of years old. And uranium to lead gives off helium. Helium is produced. It can move through rocks. Since rocks are porous, the gas escapes through the rocks. And helium being a slippery molecule, we shouldn't find the kind of helium that we have in these zircon crystals, because billions of years, you'd have plenty of time for the helium to basically leak out and escape into the atmosphere. So anyways, Dr. Russell Humphreys did all this work. And notice what he said in this.
Not just him. It was a whole group of.
Right. The whole rate team. Yeah. Baumgartner, Austin. And so here.
Oh, but they're rocks, though.
And this goes to.
Doesn't count.
Yeah.
Yeah, they'll immediately start attacking the sources a lot of times, especially people who don't know what they're talking about, and say, well, that's a creationist source, therefore it's wrong. This is a clear ad hominem argument. Yeah. And I would just like to emphasize before you continue that I've now published in the Young Earth literature, and I can tell you my paper went through peer review. Okay. Right. I got it back several times, okay, with suggestions and criticisms. And in my case, it was even from a guy who actually disagreed with me. And in one case, he actually rewrote an entire, like half of one of my paragraphs. And I looked at it and was like, oh, that's way better. Thanks.
Oh, wow.
You know, CMI does a great job at peer review. And I don't doubt that that is the case at all these other Young Earth journals, like the Answers Research Journal, which is freely available online, so there's no excuse not to go read it. The Journal of Creation is the one I published in. Then there is the proceedings on this. That's this one here, the Proceedings of the International Conference on Creation. That's like the creationist version of PNAS, basically. There's one more peer-reviewed journal that I know of, and it's escaping me right now. But Young Earth creationists do legitimate, real peer review, and we have disagreements in-house, which means that there are people criticizing each other within the community, providing as iron sharpens iron. Okay, it's a real scientific community. It is not a bunch of crazy random people. These are people with PhDs from major universities, secular universities most of the time, and people, you can't wave this away by attacking the sources. Is all that I'm saying. These are legitimate scientists with legitimate degrees, and they're doing real peer review and publishing.
Man, good for you getting your papers published, Ben. You're right. It's a rigorous process. You've done excellent work, brother. And rather than people attacking the sources, attack the arguments, attack the math, attack the data. And right here, they can look at this. This goes to a debate you had with Adam Terry. And he and others, they will ask, show me a scientific evidence that doesn't just limit the age of the earth, but actually gives roughly 6,000 years. Well, here's one. The authors here said, though the rocks contain 1.5 billion years worth of nuclear decay. Okay, so people wondering what that means. Basically, you have evidence for 1.5 billion years worth of nuclear decay from uranium to lead in the zircon crystals, but then you got way too much helium present in those rocks for those rocks to be billions of years old. So how do you account for that apparent discrepancy? You got evidence for 1 billion plus years, but then evidence for just 6,000 years. Well, a good conclusion would be, okay, you had all of that decay from uranium to lead, but you had it quickly. The decay occurred in an accelerated manner in order to retain so many helium atoms. And so anyways, his conclusion shows that the helium has only been leaking for roughly, there it is, only 6,000 years plus or minus 2,000. That's just the nature of how those things work. So, there's a few pieces of evidence. Praise, did you want to give or offer a piece before we wrap up? Praise is like, oh, I'm already in a deep sleep from this marathon. So, Sam, Ben, this has been a ton of fun. We all know we could spend the next 4 hours going over evidence, but I think this is a good place to wrap things up. Ben, I want to showcase, though, something really quick before we do wrap it up. I want to send people here. William Lane Craig. So we did a roughly 3-hour show responding to William Lane Craig and Theistic Evolution. And then we did one here, The True Origins of Young Earth Creation. That one baffles me because you did such a good job there, Ben. I'm surprised Inspiring Philosophy hasn't accepted correction on the main topic of that program. So people can check those out on YouTube. I should have them listed in the description box of this video, but those were a couple of gems.
Yeah, he just blocked me on Twitter. That was his response.
Oh, wow. It's why, yeah, I mean, it's why he wouldn't be able to counter such a video, because just silence the ones correcting me.
And Redeem Zoomer did sort of refer to that when he referred to Clement of Alexandria, and he put their pictures up on the video there. So I think he's definitely referring to IP's video there.
Yeah, well, he used several of IP. He's kind of a hybrid, it seems, of Hugh Ross and IP, is what I got from his video. Praise, any final thoughts from you? I appreciate you joining us, brother, to help us out with some of the technical stuff and to help us with the video that we responded to. Very helpful. Any final thoughts from you, Praise?
No, just to be open-minded, because there's a lot of people out there that are skeptical to young Earth creationism, and they think they're like a bunch of cultists, weirdos out there that are, crazy fundamentalists. It's not true. I mean, just look at with some of your guests that come on here. Who is that? Berkman has 10 degrees or something. That's just amazing. So I would just say keep an open mind and challenge these points tonight that we're showing. I was going to add, as I mute, but I would just say collagen and dinosaur bones. Right. I mean, to me, that's pretty convincing evidence to me. But yeah, great work. I appreciate you having me on.
Great point, Praise. Great point. Collagen and dinosaur fossils, and we're not playing around with that one. Sam, you referenced it. We did a few-hour show a couple months ago with Dr. Joel Brown, molecular biologist and geneticist, if I remember correctly, and he went over his work at Creation Research Society, CRS, showing that even with the best conditions and parameters, right, Sam, if I remember correctly, that collagen couldn't last even, what was it, 500,000 years? Or, I mean, it was nowhere close. And this was like the best possible scenario for the evolutionists. And yet we find collagen in samples supposedly 65 million years. And so.
Oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I was just going to mention that is something that has been extensively published on in the secular literature.
Yeah, Donny had Dr. Mark Armitage on years ago, and he made a prediction. So for the critics in chat saying that, we're not doing our job, he made a prediction that we're going to find that soft tissue in trilobites. And guess what? You can go now and you can search, and they actually have found it in trilobites now. And so we're going to say that we're going to start finding it. This will be a prediction that I guess I'm just kind of repeating, that we're going to find it in the same ratios that we find it within the dinosaur bones, which means that they were laid down at the same time.
Because trilobites are way older, supposedly, right?
Yeah, that's Cambrian.
Yeah.
We're talking
way down there.
Yeah.
Look at
them over. They don't care.
But look at this rescue device. Those may be the best lab conditions, but they're not actual geologic conditions for my imaginary, timeline going back 65 million years ago to, they're going to have to creatively, I'm tired, build these, make up these imaginary conditions at that time period in the Jurassic, Triassic, Permian, in order to say, see, these are conditions that I've come up with. No, I mean, we've demonstrated that their rescue devices don't work. Sam, you remember in that program, we spent a lot of time leading up to that program on dinosaur soft tissue. We've done many. We did one with Brian Thomas as well during our conference.
That's right.
And we hit Dr. Joel Brown with just about every possible rescue device. I even scoured Reasons to Believe website, and I got all their possible answers from Fuzz Rana, and we addressed them. They don't work.
I mean, I actually saw Brian Thomas speak on this recently, and I brought up Mary Schweitzer's claim that iron and from heme can cause the preservation or something, and he actually gave me a reference to a paper where they studied it and showed that it didn't, and it actually made it worse.
Yeah.
I have that reference now, so.
That's awesome. Doki says creatively. Let's say it together 10 times fast. Okay, gentlemen, I haven't eaten in a while. This is good. I'm going to get a little bit of food. And Ben, it never feels like 3 to 3.5 hours with you during these response videos, brother. We're going to have to somehow find another response video, a video worth responding to, because these live reaction videos, they're fun. You never know where they're going to go. So I listened to this video when we first prepped for it about a month ago. So listening to it again here just showed me how underwhelming the points are. Anyways, Ben, Sam, Praise, any final words, final thoughts before we close it down for tonight, brothers?
Hey, thanks for
Believe
having me
on
on.
Jesus Christ. I'm sorry, go ahead, Sam.
That's a good
What'd he say?
final thought, Praise. Believe on Jesus Christ. Very good. Sam, what about you?
Amen. No, I was just going to say thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, Donnie, Ben. It's always a pleasure having these conversations with you. Congratulations on your degree. He's a scholar, yeah, and your publication. So, and Praise, good to see you too, man.
Likewise, Sam. God bless, man.
Sam and Praise go way back.
Oh, yeah.
When they used to differ so much on everything and now basically perfectly aligned. So life's good. And Ben, you congratulations. Like Sam has said, you give us some great shows, information packed shows, and you're putting in the work. I look forward to reading your new publication in the Journal of Creation, and you're doing a great job at staying up to date on all this.
I can send it to you if you want. I'll give you a free copy.
Ooh, okay. There we go. Christmas early this year.
No, I just say thanks for having me on. I really enjoy these discussions. I would do it if it was just us and nobody was watching.
Yeah. And isn't it that much cooler? That's true. Me too. But yet we get to do it with the extra benefit of having a live audience here to engage with some of our favorite critics that we get. And it's all love, critics. If we come off aggressively here and there, we're just aggressively taking on your arguments. But we do love you, and we want you guys to come to the knowledge of the truth. And so, Centurion, great presentation tonight. Appreciate it. Glad everybody enjoyed. Share this content around. Share this on social media. Share it on YouTube. Mention it in your feeds. Force these theistic evolutionists to respond to our best arguments. Because Ben, if I remember correctly, at some point in the show, you made the really good point, brother, that these critics need to be addressing. I feel like Ben was frozen there. Okay.
Yeah, we lost him.
Yeah.
Got raptured.
Yeah, I thought he's really liking what I'm saying with that smile, or he froze. So what Ben was saying, and it really has been a while since I've eaten, so it's hard to get some of this out. But yeah, they need to address our best arguments. That's what I wanted to say as a final word. So Sam, Praise, great stuff. You guys are getting a raise, promotion. That's why we pay you the big bucks. God bless you. Thank you so much to the audience for tuning in. And we will see you tomorrow night for probably another 3.5 hour, 4 hour show as we got the great James 2 debate. God bless all.